20 seconds.
Okay.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition this morning of the most disruptive show in those states, in the Independent Corner. I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, first up, in the news this morning, scientists at Imperial College London have tracked antibody levels in the British population following the first wave of COVID-19 infections in March and April. Their study found that antibody prevalence fell by a quarter, from 6% of the population around the end of June to just 4.4% in September. That raises the prospect of decreasing population immunity ahead of a second wave of infections in recent weeks that has forced local lockdowns and restrictions. Quote, "We can see the antibodies and we can see them declining, and we know that antibodies on their own are quite protective." End quote. That comes from Wendy Barclay, head of the Department of Infectious Disease at Imperial College London. I'll continue with that quote. Quote, "On the balance of evidence, I would say with what we know for other coronaviruses, it would look as if immunity declines away at the same rate as antibodies decline away, and that this is an indication of waning immunity at the population level." End quote. I was actually thinking about this, having a conversation with somebody about this the other day. This is the real problem with the vaccines. If you have fading immunity on a fairly short time scale, on the order of, a couple of months, not a couple of years, but a couple of months, then what do you need to do? Do you need to just continuously roll out new vaccines or roll out more vaccines to reinfect people to keep that immunity up? Is that the idea? We're going to be talking with Dr. Mikhail Kogan about this later, but Jamarl, I saw you posting this in here. What was your take on this?
I thought this was interesting. I thought this threw burning hot acid on people pushing this notion of herd immunity. Because based on this, even in hotspots, people weren't developing this kind of in growing numbers like you would expect. Like you would expect the immunity to go up, I would imagine. But in this case, in 3 months, it dropped like a stone. And even then, they have such small numbers. I mean, you're talking about like 4% of the population. And that was even apparently in hotspots, like in Germany. And so it's, like the vaccinations, I would imagine you would have to get several or multiple steps or levels of it. But the idea that this is going to go away seems farcical at this point, especially with the winter coming. That seems like it's only going to get worse. This is not looking like a great 20, or let's say beginning to 2021. And by the way, that's regardless of who wins this election, regardless. So, yeah,
it's true. Yeah, I don't see this going away. This is that's exactly the thing. Obviously, who wins the election is going to have some effect on how we deal with it. But also, if you look at the daily new confirmed COVID-19 cases chart per million people, if you do it on a per capita basis, basically, it's frightening to see a bunch of countries having suddenly these sharp upticks in the period over, say, the last month, where the United States ruled for a while. We sort of had this second wave in late July, early August. And so there's like a hump, but then you see these other countries shooting up way past it to rates way higher than you've ever seen it before. I kind of almost wish I could just show everybody the graphic that I'm looking at right now. But France and Netherlands are like neck and neck with over 500 new daily confirmed cases per million people. They're way up at the top. Then Spain is down in third place, kind of a distant third. Then the UK, Poland, Italy, and then way down below there, you see the United States. And then a couple notches below that, you see Germany and Russia. So just to give people a sense of the rate of new infections on a country-by-country basis, it's interesting to see the U.S. dropping pretty far below out of first place. Not not good, because what's actually happening there, of course, is other countries are suddenly getting a massive uptick of infections. It's not like we're getting dramatically fewer. It's just that other countries are getting dramatically more. But anyway, no, this isn't going away. We're going to have to figure out how to live with this for the time being. In our next headline, in related news, Germany's Angela Merkel and France's Emmanuel Macron are gearing up in preparation for the announcement of new and stricter lockdowns in their countries. More than half, back in the United States, more than half the total number of people who voted in 2016 have already voted early in 2020. That's over 71 million people in total. So with 7 days left to go until Election Day as of last night, 69.5 million early votes had been cast as of Tuesday afternoon. That's about 1.5 million more people's votes tallied in that day-long period. That's 50.4% of the total turnout from 2016, according to the U.S. Elections Project. That includes 46.3 million votes cast by mail-in ballots and 23.1 million in-person votes. There were total of 47.2 million early votes cast in all of 2016. So, as makes sense, we've already dramatically passed that mark. That's 22 million more early votes cast this election cycle than in 2016. That's not terribly surprising because of, the coronavirus and everything. I'm curious, though, if that's going to be some long-lasting change in how people vote. I mean, do you see that, Jamarl? Do you see in 2024, 2028, assuming we still have an intact country, just taking that for a second, do you see people switching more to early voting or to mail-in voting, or do you think they'll kind of go back to normal once the virus
that's
is
a good question.
somehow assimilated into daily life?
It's interesting because it seems that the virus is changing our behaviors or habits, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
But like anything else, when something is in the short term, if it happens long enough, it becomes normal. Relative to the society, it becomes normal at a certain point. And so if it's one of those things where mail-in voting becomes easier, maybe. But I don't know. I think voting is ingrained, like going to the polls and it may be part of the act itself that people are so accustomed to. It's kind of like smoking. Sometimes it's tobacco. Sometimes it's just a very act of smoking or bringing something to your mouth. Over and over again. It's kind of a repetitive act. Well, it's unclear. I would imagine more people are probably going to start early voting. But whether that takes the lion's share, I don't think so. I think it's still going to be just walking, standing in line. Because you see how people standing in 5-hour lines. And so I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, you'd hope for, and there are obviously potential problems with this, but we live in 2020.
Right.
You'd hope that there would be some convenient way to add in online voting in a much larger fashion that let people do that. And there are problems there. Mail is, in some ways more secure. You have a physical copy, but it's also a lot harder, it seems, to verify on a mass basis the validity of a lot of this stuff, and then it's susceptible to deliveries. That's all this stuff.
Yeah, it's not the ease. It's the it's voting. It's not the ease of voting. You want it to be legit, because at the end of the day, you need people from the other side to be able to say, okay, fair enough, it was a fair contest, my guy lost. And if you don't have that ability for them to say my guy lost, then you have problems. Because then the person is incentivized to say, okay, my guy didn't lose. Or I don't believe my guy lost. Or I don't believe in that contest. Or that contest seems fraudulent. And this could be people legitimately thinking that. But like you said, even the appearance of impropriety is in and of itself a problem in politics. So, the issue, I think the issue is the ensuring that vote is secure. And we don't have that now. And if that was online, that would get worse.
It could. You could see it getting worse, or you could see it getting better. Part of why we would think it would be worse is that for the last two election cycles, including this one, we've, a lot of what the news has been accusations of foreign countries trying to hack into our election systems, of how our electoral systems, including voting booths and everything, are very susceptible. So, maybe that's top of mind, but that you can almost think of it like an engineering challenge. You can technically figure out a bunch of ways to make it safer and more secure to do it online, because you have the automatic tabulation of data, you have automatic verification. You can, if you do a good job at it, you're an ex-software engineer, maybe the current one, you just put more work into it. And there are ways, it's not like a mathematical impossibility to get it right. But there is this perception, I think, that it would be more susceptible. In any event, got a few more headlines to get through here. Poland's powerful ruling party leader urged his supporters Tuesday to defend the predominantly Catholic nation's churches, potentially setting the stage for clashes with demonstrators angry at a court ruling that severely restricts abortions. That call Tuesday from Jaroslaw Kaczynski, a conservative, drew strong condemnation from the main opposition head, who accused him of deepening the nation's divide, inciting hatred and civil war. Poland's archbishop appealed for calm and respect for churches. The country's top court on Thursday ruled that abortions due to fetal congenital defects are indeed unconstitutional, further tightening one of Europe's most restrictive abortion laws and triggering protests in the country. Those ensuing protests/demonstrations in violation of pandemic restrictions entered their sixth day on Tuesday and have included angry gatherings and obscene chants before churches and even disruptions of masses. In a Facebook video message, Kaczynski insisted that the ruling was in line with the Constitution and said the protests were marked by anti-church nihilism. He's saying we must defend Polish churches. We must defend them at every price. Opposition Civic Coalition leader Boris Budka reacted by saying that words calling for, quote, hatred, inciting civil war, and using party forces to attack citizens are a crime, end quote. He warned that the opposition could seek to bring Kaczynski before a special court for politicians. In my next headline here, speaking before his AK party lawmakers, Erdogan today accused some Western countries of wanting to relaunch the Crusades. That's a quote, wanting to, quote, relaunch the Crusades, end quote. This comes after the French magazine at the center of the dispute over the right and reason to depict Muhammad, Charlie Hebdo, released an edition with a mocking caricature of Erdogan on its cover. That's a move which the Turkish government has called rude, ill-intentioned, and insulting. Specifically, Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, long since at the center of this dispute. They were the ones really pushing the boundaries here. They were the recipients of the attack years back. Anyway, specifically the cover that they released has Erdogan sitting in a chair, like a love seat or something like that, sipping a beer, lifting up, looking at somebody, looking at a woman's butt. It's a little bit hard to explain. It's like mocking him totally. You can go check it out for yourself if you want to. Again, mocking a head of state. Turkey's government would respond to that pretty harshly. But accusing Western countries of wanting to relaunch the Crusades definitely does sound like ramping up rhetoric. Sounds like an escalation. Jamarl, what's your take on that?
Well, we call him neo-Ottoman all the time. And we make the point that says, Erdogan wants to relaunch the Ottoman Empire and whatnot. And so is there a drastic difference between those two things? From his standpoint, the Crusades thing is a religious thing of, Islam, Christianity. But is there really a massive difference in saying that he's trying to renew the Ottoman Empire that collapsed in the First World War versus, him saying that these guys are trying to relaunch the Crusades? Is there a difference? I'm asking. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. I get the point you're making. I don't know. We could get into it. I've got one more headline I want to get through real quick here. In Sudan, Sudan's government has doubled the price of domestically produced fuels and more than quadrupled the price of imported hydrocarbons. The government, which has long fixed fuel prices at some of the lowest levels in the world, raised the price at the pump of locally produced diesel to 46 Sudanese pounds a liter from the previous 23 pounds. That new total is about 83 cents per liter in American dollars. Acting Energy and Mining Minister Khairi Abdelrahman announced this at a news conference Tuesday evening last night. Sudanese pound is officially pegged at 55 to the dollar, but on the black market on Tuesday, $1 fetched 235 pounds. So there's some hidden inflation going on there. Frustration over the queues to buy fuel and bread helped trigger the uprising that ousted longtime President Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. Of course, the concern here is if you've got queuing to buy fuel, if you've got prices going up potentially, either way, it can be an ugly scene locally. And with a coup so recently, I'm curious to see what happens in the next couple of years. Also, interesting to note this coming on the tails of the $335 million payment to the U.S. I believe that's about right, either 335 or 355, to sort of move on from Al-Qaeda attacks back in the 90s. That, along with the deal between Israel and Sudan signed sort of under the auspices of American diplomacy, those coming in just the last couple of weeks, I can't help but feel there might be some sort of relation between these events. But maybe coincidences are just coincidences. In any event, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's go into a break. Jamarl, we can come back on the other side. You're going to do your monologue, and then maybe we can come back to that conversation at some point during the show about the difference between Turkey accusing Western nations of wanting to relaunch the Crusades and us, along with other folks, looking at Turkey and accusing them of wanting to recreate the Ottoman Empire. There is a parallel there, but there are some key differences too, I think. In any event, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute with Jamarl's monologue.
Fault Lines.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, definitely give us a like and definitely share it. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can give us a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I quibbled back and forth over what I was going to do this monologue on. There's an issue in Utah where the United States has started to ration care. And we repeat that. Where hospitals in Utah, this is Utah hospitals prepared to ration care as record numbers of COVID patients flood their ICUs. And this basically gets into the idea that the doctor is saying we're so slammed with COVID patients. And let's be honest, slammed and juxtaposed against not having the supplies or the facility or the manpower that we need, that we are going to the point of basically determining who gets care or who doesn't based on predefined factors. The United States, richest country on the planet, the president, 2 a.m, can hit a button and somebody somewhere dies. And yet, we don't have the ability to take care of our own people regarding healthcare. The other story, though, I really wanted to get to has to do with inequality and the prediction that regardless of who wins this race, meaning whether Joe Biden takes it, whether Donald Trump takes it, that the result is still going to end up being some level of political violence. Now, the researchers, this is out of BuzzFeed, they basically make the point. They came up with a political stress indicator, and it gives the amount of stress that a society is encountering based on various factors. And the key factor that the researchers in this paper are coming up with is inequality. That you have political instability, you have a discrediting of the political class, you have a competition between the elites. And this prediction, believe it or not, was made a decade ago. Right here. This is on BuzzFeed. And it says, many Americans cling to the idea that if Joe Biden wins the presidential election, calm will return to the nation. Not so much. Not so much. And his point is, two academics make the point that the political violence, we're going to see it regardless of who wins, Biden or Trump. That things have gone too far and the structural issues are too deep. That Trump was just gasoline. He wasn't the cause. This is something that I've been saying for a very long time. And this is something that, right, many lefties have been saying, that Trump is not the cause. Trump is only a symptom. And as a symptom, pretty much gasoline on the fire. The tendency is to blame Trump, but I really don't agree with that, Peter Turchin, an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of Connecticut who studied the forces that drive political instability, tells BuzzFeed Trump is really not the deep structural cause. The most dangerous element in the mix, argued Turchin and George Mason University sociologist Jack Stone, is the corrosive effect on inequality on the society. They believe they have a model to explain how inequality escalates and leads to political instability worsened by elites who monopolize economic gains, narrow the path to social mobility, resist taxation. Inequality ends up undermining state institutions while fomenting distrust in the system. Think about it. If the government's job is to ensure that the public is whole, that there's a social safety net, that there's honesty and fairness within the context of competition and the people in the society have an ability to move into different class groups. A society that is ossified, a society where people take the resources. When Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, that is a society of elites that are basically hoarding and monopolizing the resources. Now, if the government's job is to ensure fairness, ensure some level of equality, ensure that the public itself has the ability to move up into the upper classes, and to ensure that the public remains whole. If you have 95% of the income gains going to the top 1%, and that's going to be worse under Trump, by the way, what does it mean for the society? How can you have a cohesive, some level of understood equal society that is has credibility, and that the public itself can deem with a certain degree of integrity, when you also have a huge amount of the resources being hoarded to the top, and policies that make all the sense in the world, like dealing with issues of healthcare, dealing with issues of education? You have trillions of dollars in education debt. You have people, in this case, literally, hospitals that are talking about rationing care because they don't have the resources necessary to do the job that they need. This is the society to which they're describing. And this is the society to which he described 10 years ago. Building on Goldstone's work showing that revolutions tend to follow periods of population growth and urbanization, Turchin has developed a statistic called the Political Stress Indicator. It incorporates wage stagnation, national debt, competition among elites, distrust in government, urbanization, age of structure of the population. Turchin raised warning signs of a coming storm a decade ago, predicting an instability that would peak at the year 2020. In the United States, we have stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between the rich and the poor, overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, exploding public debt, he wrote in a letter to the Journal of Nature. Now, historically, such developments have served as a leading indicator for looming political instability. The interesting part there are advanced degrees. Imagine for the moment if you get an advanced degree, you get a lot of people with advanced degree and they have nowhere to use them. Meaning you have all of these people that are graduated with mounds and mounds and mounds of debt, and then they can't necessarily affect the degree to which they have. Would that create stress and conflict in the society or not? I'm telling you, it will. Even seeing the distinction between people who are vastly and dramatically rich versus people who are poor creates an instability in the society itself, even from the standpoint of an emotional friction that seems to cut down on lifespan. It's seems to be part and parcel to what it means to be human. Today, with the nation in turmoil, Turchin prediction seems remarkably prescient. We live in a pandemic hellscape that is disproportionately harmed Black and brown Americans and those living in poverty. We have widespread civil unrest over racial injustice, and we're hurtling towards an election in which Trump is stoking unfounded fears of voter fraud and refusing to commit to a peaceful transition of power. There's a chart here that is looking at political instability before the Civil War and political instability now. And while most people don't look at this and say, okay, look, there's going to be a civil war, I think people do look at this and think to themselves, this looks bad. And whatever people are thinking, I think they are comparing America to what it has been over the past 50 years in a sense of certain stable handover of power and everything else. That doesn't look like what this is. And his depiction is of a country that is basically collapsing. I'm worried about this no matter who wins, he added. The social problems are gasoline, Trump is throwing matches. It says the PSI doesn't explicitly address America's divisions over racial justice. Race has been an enduring fault line ever since the founding of the Republic, Tertius said, but he argued that it's the additional dynamics captured by the PSI that explains why tensions are boiling over. In short, given the accumulated grievances, anger, and distrust fanned by the last 2 decades, almost any election scenario this fall is likely to lead to popular protests on a scale we have not seen this century, he and Turchin wrote in a recent article for the Bergen Institute, a think tank based in Los Angeles. Look, I'm going to end this here, but he's making the point that people think that because our country has exceeded for, 200 years or so, that we will continue to. And because we haven't seen the political violence that are in some other countries, we haven't had the election issues that are in some other countries, that's coming to an end, that those things are coming to a head. And he even makes the point the social system we live in is extremely fragile. Now, again, social scientists aren't saying there's going to be a civil war, but his point is not so much that there's a civil war. His point is that we're going to see political violence on a level that we haven't seen. And it's not because of Trump. It's because of structural factors that's causing a long-scale decline in this country's ability to function, and even in the credibility of this country to function. Shane, what do you think about this study? I mean, the guy, he seems to know his stuff, and like I say, he predicted this like a year ago. And they even make this point about low infant mortality being one of the leading indicators for a short-term changeover of power, or like political instability. Meaning when there's like a low infant mortality rate or high infant mortality rate, where the kids are dying at a younger age, and those things are indicators of crisis. Yeah, this doesn't look good, and this is something we talk about all the time.
Yeah, in a broad sense. Yeah, so the guy you're talking about, Peter Turchin, I've been following him for a few years, and it's interesting to see him coming back up. He'd done some work around the time of the Occupy movement, too. I found out about him a little bit later than that. He works in this field, cliodynamics. It might even be one of his own creation. It might be a term that he coined, but even if I'm wrong there, it is. I'm actually just checking it back in 2003. Basically, the confluence of like cultural evolution, economic history, sociology, macro sociology, and mathematical modeling. So doing these kinds of models that you're talking about, where he's trying to use historical data sets to identify like larger trends in stability and in the courses of states and civilizations even. So it's interesting work, fundamentally. I don't know. I mean, my response to it broadly is, yeah, we're seeing a lot of this stuff. We kind of don't need a mathematician to tell us that this is what we're seeing. We're seeing it happen. We can feel it happen. You get that whenever you get into a debate with somebody who's on the other side of this. By and large, you're having a harder time reaching across that divide. So, one of the key things there, and this is also something we talk about, is it's the relative inequality. It is, in the community that you're living in, if, whether you're doing poorly or you're doing very well, if there are a bunch of other people who are on the far side of the income spectrum from you, that's a problem. And it's a problem not just for psychological reasons, but also because, it's revelatory of deeper, weird sort of structural bifurcations in the society itself, where there's probably not a clean path to increase your wealth in a durable way compared to the overall rate of money growth. And so people who are currently poor are by and large going to remain poor, which is a real violation of a really core component of the American dream. The pursuit of upward mobility, the belief that you're not born into a class in some sense, or that if you're born into one, you can, in the course of your life, elevate yourself out of it. That really is a deep part of the sort of American self-conception, ideologically at least. I'm not saying there's a material basis for it, but at different points there has been more of a material basis for it, and we're shifting away from that. It's been a lot harder for people to get out of those grips. So, I think that's fundamentally one of the deeper sides of it, and you were right to highlight that. In any event, interesting stuff to look into, and I'd recommend that folks check Peter Turchin out. Also check out, I think he has this organization, SECHAT. I think it's SECHAT. just does interesting work too. Strongly recommend checking that out. In any event, we are going to be going into a break here, back on the other side of this break with Dr. Mikhail Kogan, talking about Initiative 81. That's an initiative in D.C. to decriminalize psilocybin. Also talking about COVID and more on the other side. Back with Dr. Kogan in 1 minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And our guest for this segment and the next, Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He's the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. He's an associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and he's the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute. That is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Kogan, thank you again for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning. Doing really well, although, of course, not the easiest last couple of weeks. We all know that. But always exciting to be here with you guys.
So what do you, let's get into that actually. I want to talk about a bunch of stuff here, but how is it, thank you for being with us. How have the last couple of weeks been for you, and what has been difficult about them?
Well, I mean, in part, we all know that the number of cases is growing. Election is coming. So I think we are definitely under more stress just from our external environment. But I think also as weather is starting to cool off and kids are more inside the house, I've had a couple of episodes where my patients have been tested when everybody taking Zoom and suddenly somebody starts playing with a dog downstairs. There's loud barking. I'm in the middle of seeing a patient via telemedicine. So, I think that's piled up on top of the larger stressors in the mind as to sort of what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Is this the third wave? Is this just, we never had waves, we just have continuous progression? What's going to happen come November 3rd? Will some of my patients next year have medical insurance? There's sort of, a lot of things on my mind. I think a lot of things on everybody's mind.
That's a fair point. I mean, one of the things I point out to people is there may be 220,000 people dead, but from the standpoint of people who are infected, 9 million people infected? And this is a country where 30 million people don't have insurance. When Obamacare was signed, 20-something didn't have insurance. After it was signed, 20 million people didn't have insurance. And you had, 12 million people during this period that lost their insurance because they lost their jobs and those type of things. So it's like in the midst of a pandemic, you have a large number of people without insurance, despite all of these people who are infected. I wanted to get into some of the research that recently came out about antibodies. They found, the herd immunity is nonsense. That basically, even in areas with hotspots, that the antibody count within the individual was low within the populations. And so it's like the idea that they were going to get a herd immunity, or you're going to get enough people that have an immune response to that you can slowly get the virus down. That seems to be farcical at this point. What does this mean in regards to vaccinations?
We knew that. We knew that. We knew that from day one. And I think the voices of smart scientists were talking about it. I mean, if you take this COVID as a regular cold group of regular cold viruses, we all know very well that we all get colds once or twice a year, and we keep getting them. We don't develop the herd immunity to them because they modify themselves too fast, or immunity simply doesn't last.
Right there, exactly. That's what I was going to get to, mutations. What does this mean in the sense of mutations? But go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But that's where I wanted to get to. The idea of mutations. What does this mean for people to get any kind of immunity for this virus?
Well, it's going to be short-lived. So I don't think there's any debate that even, let's say you get infected, which supposedly be probably the highest amount of antibodies you're going to make compared to somebody who's just exposed and had no symptoms. So asymptomatic disease versus symptomatic. Supposedly in symptomatic, you should have more antibodies, although that should is also not necessarily correct. But, in a sense, it's going to happen with the vaccine. So when the vaccine does come alive, there's a very high likelihood that it's not going to last for very long. So it's possible that either we're going to have multiple vaccines, or they're going to have, think about how we vaccinate the flu, right? Every year there's an updated vaccine. Why? Well, because flu virus mutates, and also because it's probably that the immunity against the prior strain also wanes in a certain period of time. And so, you simply don't have enough length to cover you for multiple years. So that's a really strong possibility. Now, at the core of it, it's not necessarily a huge problem. Why? I mean, as long as the vaccine is effective, you can keep vaccinating, and we can sort of pause for a second as to some of the concerns about the vaccine. I'm just saying, let's assume best case scenario, vaccine is very safe and you can keep getting vaccinated. So eventually we can get to a situation very similar to what we have with the annual flu. But the fact that somebody was anticipating herd immunity is a mistake. And so whoever politicians or scientists who were saying that, just don't worry about it, this will go away, we'll have herd immunity. Well, there's no clue of it, there's no hint of it, and clearly, especially considering that we're on the increasing number of cases now, that's just not happening.
And where do you, so we don't necessarily get to herd immunity naturally, but if you had vaccines coming out, even if they had a sort of very limited course of effect, even if it, once they were administered, they only worked for 2 to 3 months, just to use that as a sort of brief assumption for this example. What does that look like if you're still trying to do the vaccine regime epidemiologically? If you're trying to roll those out, would you just be distributing those to the population? Would you be letting people pick those up and get their 2 to 3 month shot? Or, from your perspective, would that be too expensive? Is that prohibitively expensive? Or what does that process look like? Are we just not going to see a successful vaccine rollout? Dr. Kogan.
Well, that's a great question. It's probably the most important question right now. What role will vaccine play here? I mean, I don't think there's much doubt now at this point that vaccine is a few months away, just at least, if we can trust the news. I'm laughing a little here. So the problem is we don't know, right? So we don't know at the end of it how efficacious the vaccine will be in the first place, number one. We don't know how long that efficacy going to last. We don't know what mass production will there be. So if we need a vaccine, say, every 6 months, it means that, and we need to vaccinate a large proportion of population. I'm just giving an example. It's possible that the capacity of producing so much shots is simply not going to be there. So then you're going to have to prioritize, at least in the first year or two. And, how do you do that? So, of course, the first responders should have an offer of the vaccine first, just to protect them. And then, I think there's going to be a lot of science coming out just saying, look, this is how the vaccine is going to play in the overall treatment prevention strategies. And, the Fauci put that out really interesting. He basically said, look, there's no chance that vaccine is going to be the answer, right? The vaccine is going to be an answer, one of many and we shouldn't ignore it. We should definitely keep going aggressively, but we have to start preparing and know that lots of other interventions, distancing, precautions, everything's going to have its own role. So, but I do sense kind of, at least in some areas, in some parts of the society, there's this kind of a hype and a hope that vaccines can solve everything. It appears to be very clear that's not going to happen.
Even the speed of the vaccine is a little slightly strange. Is this, this is unprecedented, right? These guys are talking about doing a vaccine in like 6 months.
Yeah. It's not only a tight schedule, but I'm not sure that in the recent many decades, any vaccine's been developed with such a fast timeline and been shown to be very effective. So, I think we have to be cautious not only about, of course, everybody cautious about side effects, but we also have to be cautious about if the vaccine comes out to be very poor in terms of its efficacy, will we see the kind of cavaliering effect where people say, oh, I got shot, I got the vaccine, I can just do whatever I want now. We can't have that. Right? So the vaccine, no matter whether you got it or not, you still have to take maximum precautions. You still have to work on optimizing your immune system. Maybe we'll get to talk to that a little bit today because there is some significant news. And the other thing is of course, you guys also know that there's multiple different types of vaccines. So there's an mRNA vaccine, which is not even been literally mass-produced in huge amounts previously at all. So, you're talking about the brand new category of the vaccine. And I'm not a basic researcher, so my guess is just as good as everybody else's. And in terms of us to what exactly that efficacy is going to look like until we actually see the data. So we have to wait. And, that's also, to me, that's also the stressor because uncertainty in a way makes all of this even more unclear.
Let's actually get into immunity. We've got a couple of minutes left in this segment. You said you had some new news there. And pardon me, not just immunity in response to it, but in general, improving your immune system. There are different angles you can cover with this. Sunlight exposure, diet, exercise, counteracting some genetic tendencies that, different people will have if they have certain genes and they're predisposed to being sick. They might need to know that and sort of balance that. There are different angles we can come in here. And, glad to have had you on in the past. Hopefully we can keep having these conversations with you in the future, specifically on this topic. But what have you seen, Dr. Kogan?
Yeah, so I think the critical mass of the research have accumulated to say that every single person listening and every person in the United States, including pediatric population, should be tested for vitamin D. Everybody who has a level under 20, and I actually going to say under 30, and that's a vitamin DOH test, should be treated. And that, to me, I think that should be a global, and at this moment, global epidemiologic statement for the entire country. There's enough data. There's an Italian data that 80% of patients admitted to the hospital have deficiency. There's data from the University of Chicago, nearly 450 patients, that patients who have vitamin deficiency have much higher frequency of hospital admission and much higher severity. And then, of course, with all of that, we also have a randomized clinical trial of vitamin D in Spain that showed almost 90% decrease in mortality and a dramatic shortening of the hospital stay and prevention of ICU admissions. So I think with all of that combined, basically my statement on this, if you don't know your vitamin D level, get it done tomorrow. Go to your doctor, request a test. If you know your vitamin D is less than 30, make sure you take extra vitamin D. You probably should talk to your doctor to get a sense of what that dose should be. But the good news is one of those things with vitamin D, it's very safe. Even if you take, say, 10,000 units per day for a few weeks, it's very unlikely you're going to have any problems whatsoever. Now, if you're taking a high dose for a long time, you can get in trouble. But if you don't know your vitamin D level at all, I think taking 4,000 or 5,000 units for a month or so And then getting the test to check your level is very reasonable. In fact, that's what I usually tell all my patients. I just tell them, make sure you don't take the 5,000 units indefinitely. You have to get tested.
That makes sense. Yeah, you get a kind of overdose. You kind of get an overdose response to it, or your body might start to respond a little bit too far in the other direction. Real quick, right before we go into the break, and maybe 15 seconds here, is there a specific kind of vitamin D supplement that you would recommend people take for this? Yes, vitamin D3, vitamin D2, what is it?
Yeah, make sure it's vitamin D3. And you can find 4,000 or 5,000 units or 2,000 units, take 2 capsules pretty much everywhere.
Okay, perfect. Dr. Kogan, thank you. We'll be back with Dr. Kogan in a minute on the other side of this break. And we're taking calls. If you want to join the conversation with him, the number is 202-521-1320. Again, speaking with Dr. Mikhail Kogan about COVID and maybe about mushrooms. We'll see about that. In any event, we'll be back with him on the other side of this break. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Yo! Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us today is Dr. Mikhail Kogan. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, Medical Director at George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and Executive Director at the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Again, Dr. Kogan, thank you for joining us today. So I wanted to ask you about something that I found to be amazing to be happening in America. So Utah's hospital prepared to ration care as record number of COVID patients flood their ICUs. That's amazing. I mean, basically a country or a hospital in the United States is to the point where they're now talking about rationing care because they don't have the supplies. Can you talk about this, I guess, the difficulty that the hospitals had in the beginning trying to get the drugs, the supplies, the medical equipment, the protective equipment, those basic things that they needed, not to mention manpower, and how this is, I guess, hitting rural areas more so now, especially since those places don't have the flexibility in bringing in nurses and staff from elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Wisconsin. I think they're almost at the maximum capacity of all of their hospital beds, and they're building the field hospitals. It's sad. We're, many months into this, and all of this could have been planned and prevented, and it could have been organized to a point where none of this should have happened. Anticipating potential surges, every state should have had a contingency plan on how to deal with this, and yet here we are. It almost feels like a deja vu, right? As if we're back into early spring where New York was in this situation. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't have any specific answers or statements about this, except to say that it's very saddening that there's not enough leadership on both federal level and the state level to say, how do we deal with this effectively? And, some states, thank God, doing a lot better. Our area where we are, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, the area is doing a lot better. I guess, we could talk about this. We could say, why is this all happening? It's, of course, also a culture, unfortunately. I mean, if you carefully look at which states on the most rise, it's the states that think that masks are stupid. Well, you can think that, and you can also end up in this situation. So, it's a combination of factors, but unfortunately, I think the bigger question is, what do we do about it? And how do we help and move forward? I think on an individual basis, I encourage everybody, once again, make sure you practice social distancing, make sure you wear a mask effectively and wash your hands and do all the basic hygiene steps without necessarily stressing over that. So that's another thing. We didn't really talk about this, but there's also a rapid increase in number of studies showing that potentially part of the third wave or whatever it is, that we are simply getting less healthy. And it's a rapid progression of getting less healthy. Everybody was thinking, I'm going to be home, so I'm going to be healthy because I have more time to do things. Not true. It turns out the obesity rate's increasing. General stress level in population is increasing. That's partially why I opened up and said, look, I know about this and I feel more stressed, and I'm trying to combat it more with not just practices, but simply being more aware of them. I think that in itself is really important, that you're paying attention to your body messages and learn how to be, less triggered by the stressors. So all of those things, and that's a big problem. I mean, that is something that people have to deal with in general, of course. That people are focusing. I wonder what the time span is here, but it seems like the idea of being stressed and dealing with stress, per se, in itself, has reached a sort of peak, and maybe it's a relative peak. Maybe it'll keep growing, but it seems like more people are thinking in those terms than ever before, which is probably, this is an almost philosophical conversation, which we don't need to get into necessarily, but it's probably good. There's maybe a downside to it, though, which is if you're sort of thinking generically in terms of being stressed or feeling stressed, and yet you're not working on solving the underlying problems that are leading you to stress, if you're sort of viewing it as a simple measure that you have to counteract in different ways, then you might not solve your real problems. But admittedly, that is a quibble with the idea of it. And of course, you're right. A lot of people, even if they're stuck at home, even if they're trying to eat better, if they get into a negative thought cycle, if they get into a space where they seek out to food for comfort, if they're not getting outside as much because they're worried of being infected, there are different concerns here. One thing before we potentially move on here, I wanted to get in. What's your take on zinc? A lot of people for months now have been there's been this movement in the wider culture, in America specifically, that, you don't have access to these medications. You don't know exactly what's going to work, but you should be taking vitamin D. You already mentioned that one, and you should be taking zinc. What about zinc, Dr. Kogan? Yeah, so I'm in support of this. It's a relatively benign mineral. The only real true potential negative impact of taking too much zinc for too long could be a copper deficiency. So I think it gets a little too complicated, because taking a lot of extra copper is also a problem, because copper, in contrast to zinc, if you overtake it and take it for a long time, could have really serious problems like increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So it's not a super easy conversation, but I would say if you are been taking zinc for 6 months now at the 100 milligrams or more, definitely you should take a little bit of copper, maybe 1 or 2 milligrams. And I would also say that it's quite often easy to get a multivitamin that contains both. I'm not a big fan of multivitamins, partially because there's just large percentage of them are garbage. They either have synthetic ingredients or just not coloring or all kinds of stuff that you don't really need. But there are combinations of less nutrients, like a multimineral, for example, that would have a balanced zinc to copper ratio. So at some point, those who believe in this and take it should start switching over to those, or at least adding a little bit of copper to the diet, either as a supplement. And copper is in diet, but there's not a lot of it.
Absolutely. All right. You know what? Let's switch to mushrooms. We've got about 5 minutes left here. I was not. I'll be honest. When our producer booked you on this one, I was sort of delighted and surprised to see this as a topic. I almost wish we'd gotten into it earlier, although we've been having a great, valuable conversation about this. And I'm talking about magic mushrooms here. Initiative 81 in Washington, D.C. is a measure to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms, as well as other entheogenic plants. And I'm curious, Dr. Kogan, you're a medical director, you're a doctor. What is your opinion on this initiative and on those substances generally?
Well, you know my answer, since you already know that I'm been on ballots for this, and everybody who got the mailing probably have seen my face on it. So I've endorsed this initiative from day one. I think it's a wonderful initiative. It's an important step forward. Now, of course, I have a disclosure to make here. Not only do I believe that psilocybin is going to be proved at some point, it's already proven to have some efficacy for depression, for PTSD, but I think it's going to get proven to be efficacious for all kinds of conditions. And in a way, I want to practice this medicine. So once it's legalized, I want to have access to it for my patients so they can, so I can recommend it or prescribe it, whatever the path would be in the future. So that was my main sort of reason to support it. But at the same time, I also know that it's a pretty slow process. So the only place on the ballots right now is a full legalization in Oregon. Let me correct you here. It's not exactly decriminalization. That would be nice, but it's an attempt to put the discovery of someone using the psilocybin as the lowest priority for the criminal system, for the justice system. So basically, this initiative says that police should really ignore this topic, basically, as long as you're using psilocybin for individual purposes, for health reasons or whatever other reasons. So, but there's not a lot of definition how you do this, but that's the first step. Of course, anticipation that after this passes and we are not seeing any changes in spikes of psilocybin overdoses, which of course we will not, that the next steps would be full decriminalization and then moving towards medical legalization or medical status similar to what we have with medical cannabis in DC now, and maybe even at some point recreational.
Well, when that happens, I will come to you in order to get my first, hopefully, your first patient where you can prescribe psilocybin.
I'll remember that.
Right, for something. I don't know what it is. Maybe difficult sleeping or something like that. But no, I'll be your first person. I'll be your first patient. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it. We always enjoy when you come on and give us insight into this stuff. And so this is Dr. Mikhail Kogan, Medical Director at George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, and founder and Executive Director of AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Thank you for joining us. Shane, I always enjoy Dr. Kogan coming on because there's always information that I get that we don't necessarily know, and it's always that kind of update on COVID. It's hard. It's problematic, I guess, to hear sometimes when he explains the stuff about the inability of the resources, or even just what it seems like in the next year, if not longer, this is going to linger. And the stress that entails. What do you think about that? I mean, because I think both of you are right. I do think inherent to this, if somebody is stuck in the house or stuck changing their waves for a long period of time, it does affect stress. Their inability to go out the house, the thought that they're going to get sick, the things on the news every time you turn on and have all these people that are dead and 1,000 more, and you're wondering if that could be me or somebody in my family. It's stress. It really is. So I feel them. I just don't know how to deal with that. Society always has things that plague that society. People always have things that are stressors to those people, and society always has to deal with it. So it's kind of like, being able to, I guess, walk between the raindrops and deal with both. How have you been trying to deal with this from a stress standpoint?
Oh my God, man. I mean, you got to have good practices. You got to take care of yourself generally. That's with sort of general stress. You can have like specific traumas that come back up, like emotional responses, those kinds of things. And, then you got to get into some details about how you work through those, how you sort of spiritually work on yourself. But broadly, take care of yourself, move, talk with people you love, even with people you like a little bit, and get outside. you know this stuff.
And liberal amounts of
simple
alcohol
on that high level.
There's that liberal amounts of alcohol.
that can help. That can help for a night or two. Yeah, we've got to go out. Closing out this hour. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news. Scientists at Imperial College London have tracked antibodies levels in British population following the first wave of COVID-19 infections in March and April. Their study found that antibody prevalence fell by a quarter from 6% of the population around the end of June to just 4.4% in September. That raises the prospect of decreasing population immunity based on a second wave of infections in recent weeks that has forced the local lockdowns and restrictions. Quote, "We can see the antibodies and we can see them decreasing or declining, and we know that antibodies on their own are quite protective," unquote, Wendy Brackley, head of the Department of Infectious Disease at Imperial College of London, told reporters. On the balance of evidence, I would say what we know of other coronaviruses, it would look as if immunity declines away with the rate of antibody decline, and that it is an indication of a waning immunity at the population level. Germany's Angela Merkel and France's Emmanuel Macron are gearing up in preparation for announcements of new lockdowns. There were even protests. It was either yesterday or the day before yesterday in Italy on the lockdowns. So basically, people are getting anxious. More than half of the total number of people who voted in 2016 have already voted early voting in 2020. That's over 71 million people. With 7 days left to go to Election Day, 69.5 million early votes have been cast as of Tuesday afternoon, 50.4% of the total turnout of 2016, according to the United States election projection, which tracks early voting. That includes 46.3 million votes cast by mail ballot and 23.1 in person. There were 47.2 million early votes cast in all of 2016. That's phenomenal. What do you think that means, Shane? Personally, I always think we have a huge number of the vote tally. That tends to be better for Democrats. I assume that's the same for this year because, like I said before, I can't conceive of a president losing nearly 300,000 people by Christmas and the president gets elected again. I don't know what that means. So how do you view this amount of turnout? And what do you think is driving this? Do you think this is just a factor of Trump? Do you think it's COVID? Or do you think there's something else? I mean, for that matter, do you even think that these are people who are Democrats? I mean, the early voting thing may work for Democrats in normal circumstances, but this is COVID. You may have more people that are early voting than normal circumstances, which may skew the results. So what do you think about this? How do you think this, or what do you think this means? I have a bet going on this election, by the way. Back last year, 2 years ago, I made a bet with a friend of mine who's a right-winger. And she's kind of a right-winger. It's weird. She voted for Sanders, but she's voting for Trump now. And I bet her that Trump is going to lose monstrously in this race. This was like 2 years ago. What do you think all of these people are going to the election for? Like, what's the agitation? What's the thing that you think are pushing them?
They're predominantly Democrats. And, they're voting because they're voting. I mean, there are a bunch of different reasons. Yes, anti-Trump, sure, that's part of it. But that's definitely part of it. I don't know, man. What I'm curious about is, with a wave of Democrats doing this early voting, how is that going to affect the public's perception of the election going into it? Like, so say you have a bunch of Democrats who are coming out right now, and all of the news is like, oh man, it seems like it's going to be an overwhelming victory for Biden. And then the day of, you get a bunch of other evidence. You get a bunch of other votes coming in, predominantly from Republicans pushing back in the other direction. Are we going to have another repeat of 2016, where all of the main polling outlets and aggregators assumed that Hillary would win, that the Democrats would win, and they're going to do the same thing again now, and it's going to be revealed as a fake prediction? You know what I mean? What comes of that? That would be an interesting.
If Trump wins this, all polling needs to be illegal. Like it's. And I'm being hyperbolic, but for them to get this so monstrously wrong again, then the question will become: okay, were you trying to get this wrong? Meaning, were you trying to influence public opinion as opposed to depict public opinion? Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, look, I don't take it off the table that Trump could win this race. I wouldn't be shocked at all. You call somebody, the person doesn't necessarily want to tell you that they're voting for Trump. You may have a situation where, like you said, Trump voters see all of these Democrats and they decide, okay, we're going to go to the polls. Like, all of this stuff could, be shuffled. I don't think Trump is going to win, but I hold out the opportunity or the potential for it. By the way, we need to do the election chart. We need to put our bets in. Or not bets, but you know what I mean, to choose our states, kind of like they was doing in 2016. And, we can open this up for the Fault Lines audience. And we can see, who gets it right, who's closer, whose prognostication ability is, on point, and all this other stuff. It's just, I don't know, just something fun for the election itself to figure out what people are thinking and whether or not their thinking is accurate. So let's go to the next one. Poland's powerful ruling party leader urged his supporters Tuesday to defend the predominantly Catholic nation's churches, potentially setting the stage for clashes with demonstrators angry at the court's ruling that severely restricts abortion. The call Tuesday by Jamarl Kaczynski, a conservative, drew strong condemnation from the main opposition head, who accused him of deepening the nation's divide, inciting hatred and civil war. Poland's archbishop appealed for calm and respect for the churches. The country's top court on Tuesday ruled that abortions due to fetal congenital defects are unconstitutional, further tightening one of Europe's most restrictive abortion laws and triggering protests. The ensuing mass demonstrations and violations of pandemic restrictions entered their sixth day Tuesday and included angry gatherings and obscene chants before churches and even disruptions of masses. In a Facebook video message, Kaczynski insisted that the ruling was in line with the Constitution and said the protests were marked by anti-church nihilism. Quote, "We must defend the Polish churches. We must defend them at every price," unquote, in an appeal to members and supporters of his ruling Law and Justice Party. Opposition Civic Coalition leader Boyez Budka reacted by saying that words calling for, quote, hatred, inciting civil war, and using party forces to attack citizens are a crime, unquote. He warned that the opposition could seek to bring Kaczynski before a special court for politicians. Speaking before his AK party lawmakers, Erdogan today accused some Western countries of wanting to, quote, relaunch the Crusades, unquote. This comes after French magazine, at the center of the dispute over the right and reason to depict Muhammad, Charlie Hebdo, released an edition with a mocking caricature of Erdogan on its cover, a move which Turkish government has called rude, ill-intentioned, and insulting. Erdogan has also asserted that the Turkish government's right to act militarily against soldiers along the border between Turkey and Syria. Shane, I want to get back on this one. I think you may disagree with me on this, but, what's the difference between calling him, this reinvigorating of the Ottoman Empire versus him throwing, Francis trying to go back through the Crusades? It just seems like both of these guys are using historical reference to insult the other. And I got to be honest, the insults go beyond just them insulting. This goes to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it even goes to, like you said, conflicts probably in Syria. I mean, so meaning the conflict between these guys, it's almost like the language is coming from the larger conflicts in the geopolitical arena. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, okay, so there are two different levels on it. One, factually, I think that there's more accuracy to the claim that Erdogan is trying to once again fill the shoes he inherited from this memory of the Ottoman Empire. That's more accurate than saying that the EU or members of the EU are trying to kickstart another crusade. So factually, I just think one is more on point than the other. But the other thing is, even though the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic state, it was an interestingly secular one. The reason I'm saying the reason that's relevant is the Crusades are not a uniquely secular phenomenon. The Crusades are a distinctly religiously divided phenomenon. So, I mean, when Erdogan's making that claim, it's clear what he's doing. He's trying to unify different parts of the Islamic world, specifically probably Sunni Muslims, behind him by saying, well, there's this boogeyman that's going to come and try to tear you down and antagonize you. I mean, again, there are even some parts of that, yeah, I mean, France and the UK and the United States have had our hands in the Levant and in the Middle East for far too long, and to a degree that's definitely to the detriment of local nations in the region. So, I mean, there's some truth to this, but I'm really worried about the next decade's long future where we continue to be divided on these mass religious grounds, where like the terrorist attacks and the invasions and antagonizations of different nations based on their religion, in part at least, that's going to continue, because that's a death spiral. That's one of those sort of reciprocal cases of violence that just escalates over time unless somebody comes in and either blows the whole thing up with supremacy or finds a way to mediate these differences and come to some new peace on the other side of it. And right now, I don't see either of those going well.
Was it either fascism or chaos, unless people man their differences? I think I partially agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with you that from the politics of it, Erdogan, what he's doing is clear. You know, I want to bring the religious community behind me and push back against, these colonialist countries. On the other side of that, though, George Bush acted as if he was being talked to by God when he invaded Iraq. I mean, he did act like that was in part a religious crusade or religious mission in the Middle East. I don't think, from our perspective, we look at it and say, yeah, Erdogan is trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire. That's our perspective. We think that's more right. But what does it look like from the Muslim community's perspective, especially if you're in one of those countries that the U.S. or the Wonder Twins have attacked? For example, Libya, for example, Iraq. It does seem like there was this God talking to Bush in his reshaping of the Middle East. And France didn't go along with it. They had the freedom fries debacle and all this stuff in the United States. But Libya, they went along with. And France clearly, under Macron and even under the one before Macron, they do have these kind of, previous colonial pursuits. And France still does consider itself of something of an international player. So I understand what you mean by that from our perspective, it does look more right that he's trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire. I mean, for God's sake, the man is in conflict with like 4 other countries and is pushing boundaries in multiple locations. So there's that. But from his perspective and from the Muslim perspective, does it look like the West is going for a crusade, especially with the amount of resources that we've dumped into those Middle Eastern countries? I believe a lot of this is for land.
I mean, here's another side, though.
Go for it.
You just said the Muslim perspective. Is there such a thing as a Muslim perspective in the same way that I were to say, like, the black perspective or whatever?
Oh,
it's like there are a bunch of different.
You're
different.
Well, let me explain
ideas.
that. I don't mean that to use Muslims as like a monoculture. I just mean from a very specific perspective, in the sense of, because you could say, well, blacks are voting for Biden. Well, that's not all, but 90% is a heavy amount. I'm saying in this case, if you're looking at it from, let's say, a Muslim community, let's say if you just take all of the people who are in the Islamic communities in that area, and you ask them, what do you think of the U.S. intervention into the region? Would you have a group, let's say a majority, that think, yeah, this is a crusade on their part? Or do you have a group, a large number, that would agree with Erdogan. I mean, Erdogan is saying it because he believes he has some level of agreement into him saying it. I mean, do you agree with that? Or do you think, no, there's no way to have a preponderance of people who have a particular idea on things?
I don't know that it's a preponderance. That's the thing. I don't
That's
know.
fair.
I don't
No,
know,
that's
but I could see it going. I could see it going in a bunch of different ways, including there being more than the two perspectives you just laid out. But a bunch of people, I'm sure, look at what the U.S. and these other international parties coming in and doing this stuff. What they probably see is moneyed interests.
Yes.
A lot of what they see is probably, there's local political opposition to the economic interests of corporations that inhabit and, in some sense, maybe guide some of the decisions of the American state. And so they're like, all these people coming in here and killing the people I love or the people, I know for money, they probably find that disgusting. There's a religious element too, but I don't want to play up that religious element. Especially, I don't want to misrepresent like this massive population because it's just, there are a bunch of different
billions.
takes from different people in different countries.
Well, right, the billions across the world. I mean, you talk about Indonesia, et cetera. So it's not just the Muslim world.
Exactly.
I'm being very specific though when I'm talking about the Middle East. But you're right. I mean, the people there are sophisticated enough to be like, these guys are there to steal oil. But I do think there's a religious element to it, and I don't necessarily think Erdogan is completely off base in using that level of rhetoric when we use the same rhetoric for him for the Ottoman Empire. But let's do this. These are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, we're gonna have to talk about that one again because the Middle East at this point, like these countries are heating up, and a lot of influences, especially Erdogan and his thumb in Libya, Greece, Syria, etc. So let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. This is Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. We are taking your calls this segment. The phone number is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. You can also send us a chat or tweet. We're paying attention to all that stuff. Shane, this is an open segment, so you guys are free to call in at any moment. I don't know if you've heard the new Hunter Biden information that came out. Have you seen this or have you listened to this yet? So
yeah, you mean that the released clip with him talking about the China spy chief and his business partner? And,
it is very weird.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm going to read this, and we can talk about it after. I mean, I didn't give the clip, but I can read it short. I get a call from my father. This is Hunter Biden, his own voice, the leaked audio that was released yesterday. I get calls from my father to tell me that the New York Times is calling, but my partner, Eric, old partner Eric, who literally has done me harm for I don't know how long, is the one taking the calls because my father would not stop sending the calls to Eric. I have another New York Times reporter calling me about my representation of Patrick Ho, the effing spy chief of China who started the company that my partner, who is worth $323 billion, founded and is now missing. The richest man in the world is missing, who was my partner. He was missing since I last saw him in his $58 million apartment inside a $4 billion building to build the effing largest effing LNG port in the world. And I am receiving calls from the Southern District of New York from the United States Attorney himself. My best friend in business, Devon, has named me as a witness without telling me in a criminal case, and my father without telling me. Now, this is odd because I don't know who he's talking to. Patrick Ho just got convicted, like last year, of basically trying to bribe African countries when he was working in the UN. At one point, Patrick Ho used to be in Hong Kong. He used to be some kind of minister of like Home Secretary or something to that effect. But eventually, he gets convicted. He starts working in the UN as some kind of ambassador of some sort. And in doing so, he's trying to bribe African countries in order to get business deals in those countries. Well, he gets caught, he gets busted, and gets prosecuted in court in the United States. So in this weird leak, he's basically invoking a representation of somebody who just got convicted of a crime. And his partner, the one who says missing, I think he's the second richest man in the planet right now, he's bringing up business dealings with this guy in China. Now, I don't believe for a moment that Biden is under the thumb of China any more than I believe that Trump is under the thumb of Russia. But this has been the attack that these guys are going with, and their argument is Biden is corrupt, that his family, Biden Inc., is a real thing, and that for all the notions of Trump being corrupt, so is Biden, the Spider-Man thing. You know, Spider-Man points to the other Spider-Man saying you did it, and the other man says you did it. Well, in this very specific case, Biden does have a history of this stuff. If you look back at his son, working in the credit card industry at the same time Biden was working on the credit card legislation. And, you get to this stuff with the deals in China or the deals in the Ukraine, this stuff starts to stink. And, it's weird because it become a certain thing that media itself is becoming a story. And media inability or just distaste with covering things that pertain to Biden. Now, the question becomes, are they not covering this because they really do believe there's no story there, or are they not covering this in order to protect Biden? What say you, Shane? Which one is it?
I think that the few people who know the story are definitely doing it to protect Biden. They're also doing it just to keep in the gridlock, in the lockstep with the other folks who aren't covering it, because there's a lot of peer pressure that goes on tacitly in any social organization, but specifically among the flighty bird-like creatures that are political journalists. I think that for most people, they're probably just dismissing it out of hand because everybody else is. And then for the few people who know the difference, it's a damn shame that they're not being braver about this. But yeah, anyway, we've got two calls. I think we should go to them. And we are taking your calls, 202-521-1320. On the line, we've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have a comment I'd like to make. Before I go to a comment, y'all need to have Whitney Webb on. That's just my opinion. I'm not trying to tell y'all what to do. But she had an episode when she was interviewed by Slow News Day, and she was talking about strange things happening in Pennsylvania even before the incident that took place. That she was reading news articles for the past 2 weeks. But anyway, 47 Biden, 46.5 Trump on a poll from yesterday. Jared Kushner, I don't think he's naive, and I don't think he's an idiot. But like I told y'all a couple of weeks ago, they have people around Trump that don't mean him no good, and they're trying to eat away his percentage points bits at a time, giving them false information or getting them to do things, whatever. But he's still his own man. The comments he made Monday, 8 days before the election, Jared Kushner, which I'll put the link up to y'all website today. To me, that don't hurt Trump. That don't help Trump. It hurts him. And that takes away percentage points from a 10 of a percentage point to 100 of a percentage point. 10,000 people here, 40,000 people there. And you can lose the election, especially in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, especially Pennsylvania, which Trump needs. I would suggest that Jared Kushner be removed, be replaced with somebody else, because Jared Kushner is working with IC with the Clinton plan. Replace him with somebody else, and also invite your Yvette Connell with Tone Talks and a professor that helps out Yvette Connell now with the ADOS movement. Don't fool people with the new person, because Jared Kushner, that's not good what he said. It's not good. So that's all I have to say. I can't think of anything else right now, but that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Tarif. Look, it's 6 days. I mean, it's like less than a week before the election. I don't know what Trump could do to increase his lot at this point. His closing statement was the debate. I didn't think he did horrible at the debate. It showed that he could sit there and actually, control himself when he needed to. And frankly, the first debate, he would have been better off acting like he did in the third. I mean, even though he might have got what he wanted to accomplish, it doesn't serve him. None of this stuff served him. In fact, Boris Johnson, when he got elected, Boris Johnson was able to get many of the seats from labor-held districts. I mean, there were some seats. Skinner had been there forever. Skinner was like 1,000 years old. And so Boris Johnson, in order to win the next election, he would have to be able to keep labor seats. Well, Donald Trump was able to win in areas that he would have had to maintain coming into the very next election. And the things that he would have needed to do that, I don't think he did. I mean, he could have been more provocative in that office, like you said, going for the black vote outright. I mean, if Trump gets 20% of the black vote, the Democrats can never win again. Meaning, you're right, that what he probably should have done was, as soon as he got in office, realize how weird it was that he won and try to go with the election strategy from day one. Meaning, I'm going to make gains in these areas so I can maintain my station as president. He didn't do that. What do you think, Shane? Should Trump have been more laser focused on trying to win the next election, considering the last one seemed to be more of a fluke? Or, it doesn't really, matter. Like, what do you think about his chance? Let me ask you this way. What do you think he could have done from 2016 to now to try to better his chances of 2020? Because I don't think he has.
Oh, God, man. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff here, but I'll be honest, it's hard for me to tell, because so much of even the way that I think about this stuff, sadly, is painted by sort of echoes of the real, thought processes that he went through, the real interactions he had with the core people in his circle, all that stuff. So all of it is so filtered through what we hear in the media. There's no way to get direct access to it. So from the perspective, psychologically, trying to figure out what mindset he could have been in, or where he was at and where he should have been in terms of thinking about this stuff, that's hard to tell. In terms of concrete actions, even then, I mean, you say that you say that he's killed what you said, I think almost 300,000 by Christmas. Obviously, that's a forecasting there. We're not to that point, and that, of course, is well after the election will have taken place. But there's also the sliding door question of how many people, if Hillary had been president, would she have killed through inaction or incompetence? And I don't know. I don't like either of these people. I don't like anybody who's on the other side of the primaries. You know what I mean? So it's weird to feel myself defending one side against the other, but you almost want to. In any event, we've got one more call that I think we should go to before we go into our break. We've got Devin calling in from D.C. Devin, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, I've been hearing what you've been saying this morning regarding the 60% of people that have come out to vote. Who are they for, Trump, or who are they for, Biden? I'm also reading a lot of news regarding, whether the black men are going to make a difference in this election. My only question to you is, what about the disenfranchised voters who voted for Bernie Sanders and was kind of rebuffed again by the Democratic Party? Maybe this is a year where they kind of put a stamp, or certain Democrats put a stamp on, how much they dislike the establishment. What are your thoughts?
Interesting. I think most Bernie voters are broken horses. And those voters, despite being called violent, despite being called uniquely violent, I think, by Elizabeth Warren, despite being called Trump-esque, aggressive, abusive, they're chauvinistic, all of these things. They call them white, pretending as if the people of color didn't even exist that were backing Sanders. I think those people are broken horses, and those people, the majority will vote for Biden. I think the overwhelming majority will vote for Biden. What do you think, Shane? I don't think it's I don't think it's even a question. If you get Cornel West, if you get some of the people we've had on the show, hardcore lefties, and those guys are broken and they say they're voting for Biden, I would imagine that many of the other lefties are also. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah, I can see that happening. I think that in a weird way, we're in especially on your end, different guests we've had we've kind of been in some kind of a bubble where like there's this perception that there's more dissidence in the left against the DNC, against the Democrats than there actually is. When it comes down to casting a vote, particularly, like every guest that we've had on, as far as I can tell, has been in broad senses dissatisfied.
Yeah.
But is that going to stop them from ultimately voting for Biden? I don't know. Probably not. But then, of course, there's the other side of this. This is another bubble that I think a lot more people are in too, where you really don't see the other side of the iceberg in terms of how much support Trump is actually getting. It's just a matter of whether that's a majority. I think there are more people than a lot of people would expect, especially if you live in a city on the coast. But is that going to be enough? I don't know. And we still can't tell from early voting, because it leans so heavily Democratic, and it makes sense that it would. In any event, we've got to go into a break. Interesting conversation. Thank you for the calls, Tarif, and thank you for the call, Devin. We will be back in a minute talking with Margaret Kimberly from Black Agenda Report about the election cycle and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Kimberly. We're joined by our guest, Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Good to be back.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right, let's start here. You have an article up over at Black Agenda Report. The title of the article is Freedom Rider, Biden and Liberal Censorship. In this, you're talking about a couple different cases of liberal censorship, but specifically you're focusing on the New York Post story and the media blackout on Hunter Biden's emails, on accusations of corruption, and yes, on the crack smoking too. Margaret, can you make your case? What do you see happening here?
Well, we have I call this an old news story. We knew, anybody paying attention already knew, that after the United States, after the Obama administration intervened in a Ukrainian domestic dispute and sided with a group of fascists and overthrew the elected president, Ukraine became a de facto U.S. colony, and Joe Biden was the point person. His son, Hunter, was appointed to the board of a Ukrainian gas company. He made, I've seen figures varying between $50,000 and $80,000 a month. He knew nothing about Ukraine, nothing about gas in Ukraine or anywhere else. Obvious he was appointed because he had connection with his father. So it's influence peddling. It's a conflict of interest. Well, this story that has been known since 2014 came to light again when his son, who also has a serious drug problem, had left a laptop to be repaired, never went back to get it. The repair shop owner is a Republican, and long story short, gets it to Rudy Giuliani, and who gets it into the New York Post. There were emails where someone said, "Thank you for introducing me to your father," something Biden had denied ever happening, a sex tape, a crack pipe smoking tape, and so it was some titillating stuff and a little bit of substance. But the reaction from the corporate media, from Twitter, for example, Twitter simply would not allow anyone to link to the New York Post article. And Facebook, it wasn't clear what they did, but they made it less accessible. It's not clear what they did exactly. The rest of the corporate media just found various ways to throw cold water on the story. But the fact that Twitter actually made it impossible for anyone to use their platform to read what was a legitimate news story is what inspired me to write about the connections between big tech and the Democratic Party, about this cry for censorship that came mostly from liberals in the wake of the Russiagate fraud, because we were told that Russia put Donald Trump in office and they used Facebook memes and Instagram to do it. And therefore, we needed censorship. This is a terrible idea, I would think, for obvious reasons. Once you set that precedent, you cannot go back. And that means that anyone with the right connections can censor whatever they want. The internet was hoped would be this open space where everyone could communicate and everyone had the ability to express their point of view, and it has become that. But these platforms are corporate, and we cannot forget that. They decide what people can and can't say, what they will and will not allow. They have throttled certain sites like Black Agenda Report. We and other sites get fewer views for our articles. Certain people can be shadow banned. Anyone who at a certain moment in history talks about that issue that's forbidden by the elites faces being disappeared. So that is why I wrote this article. This remains a very, very big problem.
You know, the Washington Post went so far in an opinion piece to say, even if the information is true, it should still be treated as Russian disinformation. He even goes into making the argument that more likely than not, this is not a foreign intelligence operation. More likely than not, you know, do you really believe that these guys would take all this time in order to piecemeal this stuff together? He was like, probably not. But still, you should treat it as if it's foreign intelligence. That's astonishing. And in real terms, that is how they've been treating this. This is not, meaning the Washington Post and a person who wrote that article, he wasn't just saying what they should do. In real terms, he was explaining what they were currently doing. And that's the fascinating
That's
part
Thomas
about
Ridd,
this.
by the way. This guy has, I just want to throw this in here real quick. That's Thomas Ridd, the dude who wrote that article. Long history of covering this stuff. I remember seeing his name pop up a number of times years ago when doing research into CrowdStrike and the origins of Russiagate. Anyway, Jamarl.
Thank you, Shane.
Yeah.
It's astonishing. Margaret, what do you think about that? I mean, basically, they've taken this tack now that it is okay to stop information if it's related to somebody who you like. And it's basically, it's selective justice, let's call it that way. Because when Donald Trump's tax returns came out, Twitter had no issue publishing that. Edward Snowden, the leaks, WikiLeaks, all of those things, they had no issue with publishing leaks. Then all of a sudden, oh, this is a leak, so we have trouble publishing this. We don't want to do that. Isn't that astonishing? Has this been prevalent at any other point in history? Like where we could see something like this take place where they were literally erasing or trying to get rid of information?
Well, this is the culmination of an effort that's been going on for at least 4 years now. We have seen, first of all, let's just use our common sense here, Russian disinformation. We have a man who we know has a drug problem. He leaves a laptop. So what are they saying? Vladimir Putin hypnotized him into leaving his laptop, or Vladimir Putin runs a computer repair shop in Delaware? I mean, it just strains credulity. It doesn't make any sense at all. It is just what it is. A guy who was high or indifferent because he's an addict leaves his, really incriminating stuff. And by the way, in case people don't know, don't film yourself having sex. Just don't. So he knows.
Especially while doing crack. Especially while doing crack.
There you go. And if your father's running for president, it's triply bad. So how are the Russians involved? That is just stupid. But people have been so thoroughly propagandized that a lot of people believe these things. And then we see this open letter from the surveillance state people, the same people who told us there were 17 agencies who knew that Russia was involved, and then said, oh, did we say 17? It was only 3. Those people have, who are a bunch of liars, all of them, Clapper, Brennan, all of them. They also say the same thing. It's Russian. That's their fallback position. This is we see again this nexus between these people who don't have our interests at heart. Of course, liberals have talked up the surveillance state, so now liberals seem to think the CIA and the NSA are their friend, which is sad and laughable depending upon one's mood at the moment. So that's where we are. The people who used to be care about civil liberties and probably still claim to actually being in alliance with the forces who damage our civil liberties the most.
There's also, there's another take on this, which is the word that keeps getting used as disinformation, whether you attach the word Russian to that and turn it into a phrase, you just call something disinformation. If you look at and sort of feel out the connotation of that word, it's a weird word to think about. It's not, I guess the implication of it is that there's a lie that's being told, sort of administered by some state or by some higher power, whether it's an agency or whatever the case may be. That there's this lie that's being told, distributed throughout the population, silently circulating, in order to poison the well or something like this. That's sort of the feeling. But here's another way to look at it. What you could call disinformation is simply false news or falsely circulated whatever. You can actually label something as inaccurate, but disinformation sort of implies that. It gives this veil of unease or something like that. That that if it's successfully used, if it's successfully wielded and applied to a developing story, can just shut that story down, kind of right out of the gate. An interesting thing here is that I don't want to make too much out of this, but the word disinformation, as far as I can tell, literally does come from the Soviet Union itself. And in a weird way, It seems like we like the modern American intelligence state has adopted that term in order to specifically, there's this weird irony there. You see where I'm going. In order to use it largely against Russia. But the idea itself, it is itself poisoning the well. It's itself a kind of disinformation, because if you can get people to ignore a true story, true facts, just by labeling it as something, I don't know. And part of this is, of course, fake news. That's a phrase that came to the forefront of the public's attention back in 2015, 2016. That's sort of another variant of the same theme, but at least fake news is technically saying that there are facts of the story, that the story itself or some of its contents are fake, they're false, they're untrue. Disinformation is weird. It doesn't technically do that. It lives within this propaganda space where there is information and then there is disinformation that contests your information. You see where I'm going there, Margaret?
Yes, I do. It's a way to get people to not believe something that in this case is just obvious. This story is very, very simple. But by labeling it disinformation and attaching the word Russia to it, something that is very, very simple is turned into something that people are asked not to believe. Now, so you're absolutely right. People's minds have been so poisoned by Russiagate, that it is now easy to get otherwise intelligent people to believe something stupid, as in this case. And this is extremely dangerous. I think that the trauma of Trump being elected 4 years ago is something that people have still not recovered from. And whether he wins or loses, it's going to take a long time for people to get over what they were told was not going to happen. Because that means people are susceptible to all kinds of lies. And that's what propaganda is. You get people to believe something, and all you have to, it's not hard. You just repeat, and prevent any counter narrative from being heard. And voila, people will believe that somehow Vladimir Putin is involved with Hunter Biden leaving his laptop and never going to pick it up again. So yes, that word disinformation is tricky. It is, basically it means lying, so that a government gives quote unquote information that is false, which gets the public to believe in something they want them to believe. It's just lying is all that it is. So, but them labeling this as disinformation is in itself disinformation. But people have been primed to believe things they should not in this onslaught to try to prop up people who couldn't even win an election they should have won.
So let's do this.
That seems to be what it amounts to. Yeah, we're going to go into a break. And then, Jamarl, I figure you bring us back. But Margaret, thank you for joining us. We'll be back with Margaret Kimberly in just a minute on the other side of this break. She's a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. And by the way, you can and should follow her on Twitter, Freedom Ride Blog, twitter.com/Freedom Ride Blog. We'll be back with her on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Joining us today is Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, again, thank you for coming on. I want to pivot a little bit and get into voters themselves and get into the heads of voters and why voters do things that they do. One of the callers in the last break asked about disaffected Bernie voters and basically wondering where do those people go in this particular election, and are they really going to be a captured audience of the Democrats? Now, my point to him was, yes, they are. They will be a captured audience, and the majority of them will go and vote for Joe Biden, despite the fact that Joe Biden doesn't back them up, and Joe Biden attacks them constantly. I beat the socialists. Or, Kamala Harris, when asked, hey, are you going to do this from a progressive or socialist angle? She starts laughing. No. Or the people behind the scenes for the Wall Street Journal, part of Biden's camp, saying they're going to have implement austerity because they believe Trump is going to leave the coffers bare. Like, all of these things are bespeaking of an administration that those task force seem to be nonsense, like I said in the beginning. And any notion that this guy is going to be pushable or movable seems out the window. They have to know this. So what do you think about this? Meaning, where do disaffected lefties go? And where should disaffected lefties go?
Well, disaffected lefties should go out the door of the Democratic Party is what they should do. But every 4 years, people are browbeaten into continuing to vote for Democrats, lesser evilism, harm reduction, all of those arguments. And this year, it's even more intense now with Trump, obviously. And I'm noticing something that's frankly rather sad to me. People who live in safe states, that is to say, states where Biden is far ahead or Trump is far ahead, who ordinarily would be willing to vote green or not vote or write someone in, are saying we have to, are saying that Trump not only has to lose, but has to lose by a huge margin. He has to be humiliated. So people who live in New York, who I know, who ordinarily vote green, are saying that they have to vote for Biden because it's so important not only to defeat Trump, even though their votes don't count because of the Electoral College, that they have to vote for Biden and support him anyway. So I think disaffected Bernie voters are probably, most of them, 90% of them are going to vote for Biden. Some of them may not vote at all or leave that line blank and vote for other offices. But ultimately, I think they will do that. You were mentioning that some states have taken, or I'm sorry, you weren't mentioning, I was listening to something else. They've succeeded in taking the Green Party off the ballot in some states. The two of the states that flipped, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the Greens are not going to be present. I'm still voting Green. I'm a Green Party member, so I would do so in any case. But I think this is another form of propaganda. So I think most people are going to accept it, and disaffected progressives, most of them, unfortunately, will vote for Biden.
How long do you think that's going to last, by the way? Because taking the Greens off is provocative. I mean, it really is. I mean, they're basically making the argument. Because if you remember, Wisconsin was one of those states where it was only by a small margin of difference between Trump and between Biden. And I suppose their thought is, if we can eliminate the Greens, we have a better chance for Biden to win that race. That's appalling. I mean, like, that's censorship on a level that's mind-blowing, because it goes beyond even censorship into like election rigging or engineering of sorts by keeping off one of the groups from the race. It's astonishing.
Well, it's fascism, isn't it? This is at the very least very, very undemocratic that that they would deprive people of the right to the ability to vote for who they want. Now, we're dealing with something similar here in New York, where Andrew Cuomo, our horrendous governor, engineered through a commission that was supposed to reform campaign finance. He came up with this rule which says in order to be on the ballot in New York State, a party has to get at least 2% of the vote in a presidential election year. That will require the Greens to nearly double the vote that we got the last time, and which is not going to happen, I don't think, but it's something that needs to be called out. The Working Families Party is in danger of being kicked off, although I don't care about them. That's another story. But I don't think it's going to help any, and I don't think that those people in Wisconsin who were able to vote Green last time, I don't think that means they're going to vote for Biden. They may be angry about being deprived of their vote and not vote for him. I think also, I still believe Trump can win. Everyone's talking about him in the past tense, and I'm not convinced that's going to happen. He could just win the state outright. So we have the people who are screaming about disinformation and calling people fascists, undertaking a fascist political move in order to deprive other people of their rights, which is an admission of guilt. It's an admission that their party cannot count on the votes of people that they count on. And all this crying and whining about the Green Party, it's an admission that the Democratic Party needs the left. So, but of course, that's anathema to them. You see what they did to Bernie Sanders, and he's just, mildly reformist. So, yes, we're talking about fascism among the Democrats.
And it seems like that's only going to be growing. I mean, where do you think this goes, assuming that this goes into a contested election, assuming that, whether it's allegations of voter fraud through the mail-in ballots or whether it's systems breaking down and things taking a long time to get counted? Where do you think that goes, Margaret?
I think it's going to take a long time for all the votes to be counted. There's so many paper ballots this year here in New York. We had a primary in June, and some of the races weren't decided until August. And we have, of course, many, many more voters in a presidential election year. And I think this is going to be true across the country. So we're not going to, they may make a announcement that on election night, but I don't think it's something we can count on. It's going to be a while before we know who won. But what should happen with progressives? Progressives must leave the Democratic Party. That's it. That's all. They have to leave.
Now, part of that has to do with accountability, right? I mean, that basically, if you continuously stay there, for example, anti-poverty. China is running an anti-poverty program that's supposed to be finished at the end of this year. We don't do that. Don't even try. Now, if lefties, because they associate themselves with the party year after year, poverty, people living on the street, people not having health care, people, all of these issues and vagaries that they talk about are basically allowed in the backing of the party continuously. Meaning all notions of accountability have been removed from the political space. So instead of you saying, hey, Bill Clinton wanted to privatize Social Security, well, he needs to lose, or the party needs to lose if they're keeping that tenor at all. Well, instead you get approval. You get support. Even if it's, disagreeable support, you still get support. And this has taken place over the last 40, 50 years. There's a study that just came out. We were talking about it in the opening, that basically is going into inequality and showing how inequality itself leads to civil strife. And part of that is the discrediting of the political system because the people aren't necessarily doing what's necessary to A, maintain credibility by ameliorating the issues of the public itself, but B, maintaining credibility in and of itself and providing a social safety net, or be able to deal with crises when they erupt in a way that a rational government would. Accountability, I think, is the issue, right? That basically our political system, because people felt blue no matter who, that those people went and just voted for anything, missing the point that there are a lot of people out there that don't have the luxury of being able to vote for pretty much any random candidate, and those people stop being involved. Meaning the reason that Democrats lose are in part and parcel because progressives have removed all accountability from the political space. Is that a fair assessment in talking about this? Or is there, I'm aware, there's probably more to it, but how do you view that? What's your point of view on that specific issue? Is it accountability that's the problem?
It's a big part of the problem. The Democratic Party doesn't have to do anything their people want them to do, because if people are browbeaten into supporting a party that doesn't do what they want, then of course you get defeat. That's the other thing. There's no secret to defeating Trump. People wring their hands and beat their breasts about, how do we fight fascism? Well, you have to oppose it. You have to oppose it with strong policy. You can't have a weak opposition. Biden, I don't believe if Biden wins, I don't believe it's going to be a landslide. I don't believe that at all. I think it's going to be close. But he would win in a landslide if he talked about the things that people need. The last debate, he finally said he was in favor of a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's something he should have been saying all year. If they said they're going to forgive all student loan debt, what are they saying? If you went to a public college and if your parents make this amount, then we're going to forgive your debt. Not we're going to forgive all of it. He would win. So we have this party that wants to win around the margins, hopes to win around the margins, because they want to do what their donor class demands of them. And that means none of us get what we want. So if Biden loses, what should happen is that progressives should leave the Democratic Party en masse, because if they can't even beat Donald Trump, who they should have beaten the first time, if they still can't beat him, they go on and on and on about COVID and 200,000 people dead and it's all Trump's fault. How is this man still in the race? It's because they're not speaking to those issues that progressives want to hear. And ultimately, I think we have to say the Democratic Party isn't a real political party. How are you a political party that does the opposite of what your people want you to do?
Margaret, we're out of time here. We've only got a minute left here, and I'm probably just gonna, one last quick thing actually. What would you say to people who are currently considering or currently planning on voting, who've already voted even for Biden, but who have, overlapping progressive leanings? Can you make in maybe 20, 30 seconds a really strong case for why they shouldn't do that?
Because Biden is not a progressive. Biden is a Republican. What do? They brag about how many Republicans have endorsed him. They're talking about Republicans in in his cabinet. It's going to be another Republican administration. And if you don't like Republicans, you should not vote for him. You're voting against your interests. You are not engaging in any harm reduction by continuing to support the Democrats.
Thank you, Margaret. It really does seem to be a sort of contest in the minds between whether you're fed up enough with the DNC that you're just trying to sort of shut them down, reform them, whatever it is, replace them, or if you're willing to settle again. That seems to be what it comes down to. Anyway, that's the conversation we heard from a lot of our guests, at least. Margaret Kimberley, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. You should follow her on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time for our last hour this morning, the last hour of the most disruptive show in American politics. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
While Jamarl is indefatigable, I am fatigued. I'm the dude snoozing on the wall. Anyway, that's a lie. Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I just try to give you props. That's what I do. Is I try to boost you up, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's what it is.
Indefatigable.
That is what it is.
I get that from
Exactly.
XCOM. There's a thing on XCOM where you tell the guy to basically stay awake. Don't, even on the other person's turn. If the person moves, shoot them. And they call it indefatigable. I love that. I love the term.
It's a good term. Yeah. You know what? Let's just get into it. Let's get into headlines here. In the news, first, a brief COVID update. Scientists at Imperial College London have tracked antibody levels in the British population following the first wave of COVID-19 infections in March and April. And in a study, they say that they've found that antibody prevalence fell by a quarter. That's from 6% of the population around the end of June to just 4.4% in September. That raises the prospect of decreasing population immunity ahead of a second wave of infections in recent weeks that has forced local lockdowns and restrictions. In other words, when people got the virus, they developed antibodies as an immune response to them. But as with other coronaviruses, those antibodies appear to be short-lived. And the assumption here is that as those antibodies fade from people's bodies, as they get more anti in the bodies, that kind of doesn't make any sense, but just go with it. As that happens, people's immunity on a wide population basis statistically is going to go down, which means you're not going to get this herd immunity thing where you have saturation of immunity in the population. Instead, you're going to get this constant circulation. That's at least one of the assumptions here. That's one of the ways that this could go. Is again, if everybody's sort of after a couple month period susceptible to it again, then you're going to have a hard time doing these, either mass vaccinations or, as Sweden did, mass herd immunity effort. That's at least the assumption there. I'm going to quote here from the head of the Department of Infectious Disease at Imperial College London, this is Wendy Barclay. We can see the antibodies and we can see them declining, and we know that antibodies on their own are quite protective. On the balance of evidence, I would say with what we know for other coronaviruses, it would look as if immunity declines away at the same rate as antibodies decline away, and that this is an indication of waning immunity at the population level, end quote. This, you know what, Jamarl? This makes me think of all the freaking poor older folks or immunocompromised folks who are stuck at home during all this stuff. And we're like hoping that they would have a chance to get out and live in the world again and like see their loved ones and go to a museum or go to a movie or go to a restaurant for that matter, who are just, oh man, if they see this news, it's one thing to have to undergo a crisis, It's another thing to have promises of hope and some resolution of that crisis get brought back up and dragged out and dragged on for month after month after month and potentially year after year. And I just think of, we're talking about stress levels with Dr. Kogan. We're also talking about vaccines earlier with Dr. Kogan, but with stress, I just imagine how stressful that is. You're stuck. It's like a prison. And it's your own home. That's the worst thing about it. It's a place that you should, in your heart of hearts have as like a calming and renewing center, instead becomes a kind of jail. I don't mean to make it too poetic here or whatever, but it sounds bad, Jamarl. What's your take?
Yeah, it's people are stuck, and it wears on the individuals. Kogan explaining his stress levels in the beginning of it he's right. If you look at like a year, 2 years, this thing is going to drag out to 2021 easy. And as one of those immunocompromised people, it is aggravating. I am probably less reactive in the standpoint of danger than most, like in the sense of like, oh God, I'm going to die from this or that. In fact, I tend to ignore that stuff. And for me, it served me well. But there are a lot of immunocompromised people out there who, they don't, they can't ignore it. And, somebody getting sick, somebody who may even be asymptomatic can give it. Like when we go into places and they take your temperature check, that's a false security. You know what I mean? Not everybody's going to be symptomatic. The inability of people to visit their loved one in the hospital. My wife went to a dentist appointment. I couldn't even visit her. She couldn't even visit me in the hospital, despite what was going on. Like it's a weird shift in our daily life. By the same token, human beings are adaptable, and human beings have had to endure some really harsh, horrible things that they had to acclimate to. I suspect this is going to be one of them. We don't have any choice but to survive and but to endure. There is no other option. So this is where we are.
It is where we are. And, I know that we will. It's just, you say we're adaptable. The other side of that, of course, is you can get used to the worst circumstances. Yes. You can kind of create a hell for yourself.
Absolutely.
And get used to that. And that's a terrifying prospect, too. Anyway, more headlines. Let's move on quickly. Let's brush those emotions under the rug. More than half the total number of people who voted in 2016 have already voted early in 2020. That's over 71 million people so far. That's, again, over 50% of the total turnout from 2016 coming in the form of mail-in ballots. That includes 46.3 million votes cast by mail-in ballots and 23.1 million in-person votes. There were 47.2 million early votes cast in all of 2016. So we're right about at the point at which mail-in votes will have passed the line that they established in 2016, if that makes sense. We're going to be, we will have had more mail-in ballots sent in 2020 than in 2016 very soon. Anyway, that should have taken less effort to get out there. In Poland, powerful ruling party leader Jaroslaw Kaczynski urged his supporters on Tuesday, that's yesterday, to defend the predominantly Catholic nation's churches. This potentially sets the stage for clashes with demonstrators angry at a court ruling that severely restricts abortions. The call was made on Tuesday by Jaroslaw Kaczynski. It drew strong condemnation from the main opposition head, who accused him of deepening the nation's divide, inciting hatred, and civil war. Poland's archbishop appealed for calm and respect for churches, as the country's top court on Thursday last week ruled that abortions due to fetal congenital defects are unconstitutional, further tightening one of Europe's most restrictive abortion laws and triggering these protests. Ensuing massive demonstrations, all, by the way, in violation of pandemic restrictions, entered their sixth day on Tuesday and have included angry gatherings and obscene chants before churches and disruptions of masses. In a Facebook video message, Kaczynski insisted that the ruling was in line with the Constitution and said the protests were marked by anti-church nihilism. Opposition Civic Coalition leader Boris Budko reacted by saying that words calling for, quote, hatred, inciting civil war, and using party forces to attack citizens are a crime, end quote. He also warned that the opposition could seek to bring Kaczynski before a special court for politicians. Usually the politicians don't fare well when they're brought before a special court. Usually there's been some changeover of power. One party was in power, then another party is in power, and the party who's newly in power is really trying to grind out the remnants of the old party. And I mean, granted, if there are crimes that are getting committed, that's a big component of it too. But I can't help but see this purely in terms of the levers of power being wielded by one member of the state against another member of the state, in order to strengthen itself in the long run. Anyway, Jamarl, that's a little bit mechanical and abstract. What's your take on this?
I don't think it's mechanical and abstract. I mean, it's fighting of the elites, right? And the rest of the population pretty much just has to deal. It's interesting. At Poland, I enjoyed Poland. It's funny how when you go into a country, you don't really feel the politics of the country. You know what I mean? Like you're there, you're just kind of enjoying it, but you're not there. You're only kind of there as a tourist, as a guest, as an observer. But you don't really soak into what it feels like to be there. It's fascinating when you think about it. I mean, basically, you have a government that pushed through a policy that the public massively hates. You have a public that comes together in repudiation of that government's policy. Is the government going to change its policy because of it? Probably not. Does it mean the government is going to be toppled? Probably not. And so you get into this weird space where there's a certain flexibility that's afforded to sovereign states by the population itself. Meaning any law, anything that you pass is subordinate to the population, providing the population gets assertive and decides to ignore and march on that government that has been discredited. These guys are fighting, fair enough. But is it enough to undo the government like we've seen in some other countries? And I suspect Poland's ruling party is probably strong enough to endure this, just like we were strong enough to endure Trump. So it's interesting, don't get me wrong. It's political strife. But I don't know what's going to become of it, if anything. That's the way I see it, anyway. Like you said, it's kind of mechanical.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. You know what? Let's get through more headlines here. Speaking before his AK party lawmakers, Erdogan today accused some Western countries of wanting to relaunch the Crusades. Again, head of state of Turkey accusing Western countries of wanting to relaunch the Crusades. This comes after the French magazine At the Center of the Dispute over the decision to depict Muhammad, that's Charlie Hebdo, the magazine Charlie Hebdo, released an edition with a mocking caricature of Erdogan on its cover, a move which the Turkish government has called, quote, rude, ill-intentioned, and insulting, end quote. This comes as Erdogan has also asserted the Turkish government's right to act militarily against soldiers along the border between Turkey and Syria. Longtime dispute between Turkey and the Kurds within Turkey and just on the edges of its borders there. And in Sudan, our last headline here, Sudan's government has doubled the price of domestically produced fuels and more than quadrupled the price of imported hydrocarbons. The government, which has long fixed fuel prices at some of the lowest levels in the world, raised the price at the pump of locally produced diesel to 46 Sudanese pounds, about 83 American cents per liter from the previous 23-pound price. That's a doubling again. Acting Energy and Mining Minister Khairi Abdelrahman told a news conference on Tuesday evening that this stuff would be happening. The Sudanese pound is officially pegged at 55 to the dollar, but on the black market on Tuesday, $1 fetched 235 pounds. So those currency controls are failing to hide some signs of, inflation, potentially pretty damning and fast inflation. We'll see how those changes, take place in the coming weeks. In any event, frustration over the queues to buy fuel and bread helped to trigger the uprising that ousted longtime President Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. So you're seeing those queues come back, but you're also seeing prices go up pretty darn dramatically. That's a doubling of prices for most people. And we're talking about Peter Turchin and these sort of social stressor indexes and modeling long-term historical processes and political instability. Inequality is one thing. And another thing that would seem to hurt your political stability as a nation, too, is essential goods, the prices of essential goods rising, and that creates a sort of another bifurcation, another kind of inequality. As, if you can't get an essential good, if you can't get something that you need to live the kind of life that, you need to live in order to keep yourself stable or to keep your family sane or growing economically, all these different things. If you can't get that, then you're creating this serious gap between what you're able to do and what the people who can afford that good, in this case, oil, petrol, what they can do. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And let's do this. Let's go into a very slightly early break. We're going to be back on the other side of this break with Eleanor Goldfield, award-winning documentarian, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Back with her in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, you can also, whatever platform you consume us on, please like the video and share the content. You can also join in on the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, a phone call, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Joining us, though, right now, is Eleanor Goldfield, award-winning documentarian, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. Eleanor, welcome back to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start here. Hard Road of Hope. Can you explain what that is? I think we've spoken about it once before. I think we brought you on explicitly to talk about it, but just as an intro. From a standpoint into the audience for people who haven't necessarily met you before or who haven't necessarily watched this documentary. What is Hard Road of Hope? Can you give us a short explanation of what the documentary is about?
Yeah, I mean, you basically said it in the intro. It's a documentary about West Virginia and the radical history there and how folks are working to not just recover that history from the propaganda and the misinformation that is told to people there, but also to build a better future using the past and the present. And you see that with the teachers' strikes in West Virginia, and you really get a feel of that radical history there. And folks are doing incredible work to fight corporate power there, to fight the destruction of coal and oil and gas.
Well, just to be clear, West Virginia is one of the poorest states, which is the reason why you were focusing on West Virginia, or was it? I took it as because of the poverty level regarding kids. And, this was one of our major energy producing states. And yet, at this point, they fall into the bottom of the barrel in regards to any kind of economic, let's say, benefits.
Well, yes, West Virginia is the third poorest state in the nation. It's also the second most rural. That's not necessarily why I decided to go there. I was going there predominantly for dirty energy reasons. But yeah, all of this ties in together. Of course, there's no such thing as a siloed issue. Yeah. Nobody lives single issue lives. But with regards to the economy, some $5 trillion have been mined out of the hills and hollers of West Virginia since the advent of coal in the region. And that money has not gone to any of the people, obviously. So it's really, West Virginia is really just a microcosm. It's a mirror to hold up to the rest of the country. Perhaps a very, very stark manifestation of what dirty energy, what corporate power, what paid off politicians and coal barons do to a place and the people, but also a microcosm of that resistance, that radical resistance. West Virginia holds a very, very high spot when we look at the history of labor rights movements in the country. And that is a history that's been largely forgotten, largely covered over and buried on purpose. So yeah, West Virginia is really a mirror and a microcosm of the rest of the nation.
And other countries, for that matter. We can sort of pivot pretty cleanly from the strip mining of West Virginia to Western expropriation of Bolivian resources and the recent denouncement, practically by the population of Bolivia, of the coup against Morales. What was your take on this election results, Eleanor?
Well, I was jealous, to be perfectly honest, that they had a radical anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, pro-indigenous socialist party to vote for. But aside of that, I was incredibly excited to see this happen, this landslide. And it's almost like policies that uplift people and planet over profit are popular, and that's what we saw in Bolivia. And it's really, really inspiring and powerful to see this. And I think folks in the U.S. could learn a lot from what's going on in Bolivia, not just in terms of this election, but in general, how folks have organized. I mean, these elections were postponed several times. And the only reason that we're seeing what we're seeing now, Evo Morales being able to go back home and after being forced out, the only reason that we're seeing these things happen is because people did not let up, because people continued to push and say, no, you can't trample over us like this for our resources, for imperialist ends. And so I think that we could definitely learn a lot from what we're seeing happen in Bolivia.
Eleanor, there's a great video of one of the coup mongers crying, I think Camacho, if I'm not mistaken, after losing in in a landslide to the MAS party, the MAS party. What do you think happens now? Or what happens now? I mean, the last I saw, they were talking about bringing charges against, Jeanette? Enes, the woman who took over despite not getting any votes to take over. And potentially bringing charges against basically the coup government for some of the damages and some of the injuries that were taking place. In fact, one of the women who they attacked, it was a famous video of her being attacked, her head being shaved, like they were throwing stuff on her. Well, she's been elected into the Congress of Bolivia. Like, you're right. I was very excited by this because I was very upset during the coup, and I was very upset that people in the States wouldn't call a coup. So this is a replenishment of democracy of sorts. What happens from here on out?
Well, that is an excellent question, Jamarl. And I've never been good at the crystal ball, not even in the U.S., particularly not in other countries that I'm not deeply knowledgeable about. But I would say, I think what happens now is that we have to look very closely at how the U.S. responds. And I say that for two reasons. One, because the U.S. is very interested in Bolivia for several reasons, but also as American residents, it is our job to stand up and stand against U.S. imperialism, just like folks have done with regards to Venezuela. So I think our job right now, in terms of what will happen, is to really monitor that and be very vocal about our support of the Bolivian people in choosing their own self-determination, and really supporting that by keeping our hands off. So I think, I don't know what's going to happen. I doubt that, the U.S. is not the kind of person to be like, oh, cool, you legitimately elected someone. Cool, we'll let that stand. That's not how the U.S. rolls. So I think whatever happens, the U.S. is going to continue to pressure, whether that be economically or, with another coup attempt. It's difficult to say, but I can say that what I feel that our role is, as U.S. citizens and U.S. residents, is to stand in support of the Bolivian people and their autonomy by pushing back against U.S. imperialism.
And that's where my mind was going to, is that after this election, the last coup was U.S. backed through the Organization of American States. I'm kind of wondering if they're going to try something again. I think we had Wyatt Reed on from Bolivia, and he was saying he didn't see exactly how that would happen. And I don't either. But, we're in a kind of a pull out all the stops moment historically when it comes to foreign policy, and just in general, the world crisis that we're in right now. In any event, Eleanor, it might make sense to turn for a second. We're going into a break in a couple of minutes here, but I'm gonna turn back to the States a little bit early here. What do you think about the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett? What do you think about this getting pushed through the Senate? And let's start right there, Eleanor.
Well, what do I think? I'm not surprised. It doesn't. I'm disgusted, but I'm absolutely not surprised. The Democrats are flaccid on all issues that have to do with protecting people and upholding any sense of human rights. So I wasn't at all surprised. And despite the fact that when this first started, I think Pelosi said she's going to use every arrow in her quiver or some ridiculous quote like that to stop the nomination. 0 arrows used. No, there was absolutely nothing that was put up against this nomination, even though they had plenty of ways to stop it. And one such way was something that David Swanson, the anti-war activist, noted on his blog a while back, which is impeachment proceedings. If you bring up impeachment proceedings, everything else has to stop, and that includes a Supreme Court nominee. But of course, the only thing that you could really impeach Trump for are things that the Democrats do too, like war crimes. So they would never impeach Trump on anything actually valid. So they wouldn't bring impeachment proceedings for anything but a ridiculous story about Russia or a ridiculous story about Ukraine or whatever the fact may be. So I think that the Democrats knew very well from the beginning that they weren't going to put up a fight. They weren't going to stop it in any way, but they were going to pander to folks in the United States and say that they were going to try and secure votes.
Jamarl,
why don't you think? Why didn't they do that?
There we go.
Yeah, why didn't they do that? Meaning, you're right. Granted, the impeachment proceedings would have looked ridiculous since they had already tried to impeach the guy on something that was nonsense. So the question becomes, why didn't they pull out all the stops? Is it just because they thought, we're running in an election and people will penalize us for trying to prevent the election of a Supreme Court justice? Because honestly, the way we look at this from a political angle, and we look at the Supreme Court, at least I do, I'm speaking for myself, as a political institution. I've seen them that way ever since they elected and put Bush in over Gore. That was a political decision from a political body. The Democrats have to know this. So what would be the reasoning or the rationale for not pulling out all the stops? And even if they did an impeachment proceeding, couldn't Donald Trump, or couldn't they still put her in as a lame duck? He's still a president as a lame duck. So would the impeachment proceedings have worked? Trump could have lost this election and still got in Coney Barrett.
Well, yeah, and I think that the impeachment is not the only, that was just an example. There are other things that the Democrats could have done to put up a fight, but as to why, because they don't actually care. Their quote unquote progressive judges that they would have put forward would not have been much better. People like to point at Merrick Garland, the judge that Obama suggested that was then blocked by the Republicans, because the Republicans do know how to block things. But if you look at, and the interesting thing is that, and I covered this recently, Merrick Garland and Brett Kavanaugh, who was then appointed by Trump after the election, Brett Kavanaugh and Merrick Garland were on the same bench for quite some time. And you can pretty easily see how they ruled. They ruled the same 93% of the time. So it's important to highlight that the Democrats don't choose progressive judges. I don't even know if you're a progressive judge, I don't even know where you end up, maybe in a dark corner somewhere. But I think that it's important to note that progressive judges don't make it to those Supreme Court nominations most of the time. And the Democrats, particularly as they are now, where they've been moving right for, decades now, would not choose someone who actually upholds human rights and, environmental justice and things like that. And something that was also pointed out by Dan Kovalik, who I spoke to on this subject, who's a human rights lawyer, is the fact that, the Supreme Court has kind of been the ones like lagging. They will be the last to the party when you're discussing human rights issues and progress. And they really they typically don't have that much say in progressive matters, in the progress of the nation. It's just that Congress has become a cesspool of an action.
I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to take a break, and I'm going to bring you back. But no, I agree with you 1,000%. You guys are listening to Eleanor Goldfield, an award-winning documentarian, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in resource colony known as the state of Western Virginia. And of course, one of our favorite guests. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Eleanor Goldfield. She's an award-winning documentarian, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored. She co-hosts that with Lee Camp. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known to many Americans as the state of West Virginia. And by the way, you can check that documentary out, hardroadofhope.com. And also, if you're interested in following her on Twitter, you can find her twitter.com/activist Eleanor. That's ELEANOR. Eleanor, thank you again for being with us. I want to turn back to the States here. I'll be really blunt here. Who are you planning on voting for and why? Eleanor.
Well, I don't really discuss it. To me, that's I'm not going to get into that.
Too personal. Fair enough.
But I will say that the way that I look at presidential elections is don't put too much stock in it. And what I mean by that is that come next Wednesday or Thursday or whenever we get results, your life is not going to change that much because as we saw when Trump went to the hospital, the levers of power are still pulled by the people who were pulling them before when he was sitting in the Oval Office tweeting nonsense. The state rolls on. And so I think, and the choices you have are the red dumpster fire, the blue dumpster fire. So pick your poison, but you're still getting poisoned. So I think that we should look at voting, particularly in a presidential election year, as using your turn signal when you're driving. It's sure, do it. It's just a nice thing to do. But it's not going to stop you from getting hit by an 18-wheeler. It also doesn't make you a great driver if you're swerving all over the place but using your turn signal while you do it. Voting is not, by a long shot, the most important thing that people can do, particularly when you look at the fact that our entire electoral system is a farce. I mean, the way that our elections are rigged is laughable, or it would be laughable if it wasn't so sad. So I think it's important, and I'm not trying to be like a Debbie Downer here. I'm just pointing out that the amount of importance that's placed on the elections really, really betrays the fact that they are not only farcical, but they are not important in terms of the head of state who continues to propagate the gross inequalities, the gross destruction of planet and U.S. imperialism here and abroad. So I think it's important to look at the elections through that lens and understand them in context.
So what should people be doing? I mean, I don't think I entirely agree with that. I think I agree with that currently, just because, whichever side you choose, both of these guys, for the most part, have a similar, if not the same, ideology of the world. They may just be in gradients. But that doesn't necessarily mean that government at other times haven't been a force. And I guess my point is it more true that it's not a force now, or at the very least, it's not necessarily a force that is best interests of the public itself? But given the opportunity, and even from the standpoint of like political pressure, protests, all of those things also have this aspects in politics. But even that, it gets infused in law. Meaning, voting, in some respect, like you said, it does matter. I don't necessarily think I buy the notion that it's is of lesser importance. Let me say it that way. Because at the end of the day, even if every strategy the person enacts, or that groups enacts, or movements enacts, at some point, the win is the articulation into law. Or do you disagree with that? That, no, the win is not the articulation into the law. The win is something else.
I would disagree in the sense that there has been any law that has ever been passed that has not been bitterly fought for in the streets.
Oh, agreed.
So by that sense, voting is like putting the cherry on top of the cake, but you wouldn't say that the cake is the cherry. And so I think that in our current system, there have been times in the past when it was basically impossible to ignore the will of the people any longer. And so elected officials were forced into enacting something into law. You look at like the women's right to vote. We wouldn't say that Woodrow Wilson was a feminist by any means, but he was pushed into doing that. And I think that, yes, so to your point, sure. But I think that anybody that was voted into office, whether that be Woodrow Wilson or some other old crotchety white dude, would have done the same. So because the what matters is what people were doing in the streets. And so anybody in elected office at that point would have had to do the same thing because it was politically untenable to do anything else. So I think that, again, it's like the cherry on top of the cake. But if you're not baking the cake, then you're not just going to sit there and eat cherries. So I think that it's important, again, to put it in context. Not that voting, again, use your turn signal, but it's not going to save the world. And I think especially in the elections that we have today, when you see everything from interstate cross-check that pulls millions of people off the voter rolls, when you see polling places closed, right now when you see USPS being attacked brutally, which started, of course, with the Democrats as well. So I think that it's important to recognize the context in which we are, quote unquote, voting, and that our voices don't matter because a lot of them won't even be counted. They won't be heard. The way that our voices matter is when we use them in pushing towards those untenable political moments, and that happens outside of the ballot box. So no, I disagree that voting is a very important aspect of civic engagement because historically it shows that it's not.
Well, historically, I mean, even in the current moment, but you can look at it historically too. It seems to be most effective in local elections, and I think that would apply now. Whatever your political take is, if you want to change national politics, then a large way you can do that, in a weird sense, in the long run, is by supporting local leaders who really stand by your values. So whether it's your mayor or, up the chain a bit, senators, members of the state houses, those are similarly very important ways, because in some sense you're sort of changing in the long run the atomic constituents of your party. You're changing what it's made up by. If you have these three strands or three columns or something like this, three means of getting engaged. One would be voting. Two would be something like protesting or various civil, various forms of disobedience, various forms of sort of, the way that I would put this is you were petitioning some higher authority. You were showing some display of unanimity and maybe even a display of force as a population, to push for something. But you're also doing this, again, to request some higher authority make some changes. The third option, and this is where I get really interested, because it's not petitioning some higher authority, you're building up your local ability, is like local direct action, local institution building, whether it's like as something as sort of silly and accessible in its own way as a community garden, to building up various local organizations, local institutions. I think we have some agreement on that one, Eleanor. But what else would you throw into this? We were talking earlier about Nancy Pelosi with her arrows in her quiver. What other arrows are in the sort of activist quiver here of real political engagement around the world and in the U.S.?
I mean, I know it's not a fun answer because it seems like I'm dodging it, but I'm really not. The arrows, so to speak, are legion. Kind of like what the Zapatistas said, like we want a world where many worlds are possible. The ideas and the potential is whatever you can dream up. So I think that in terms of tactics, for me personally, the way that I organize now is I don't petition the government. I don't ask permission for things. I don't ask them to help me because I know that they won't. I know that they don't want to. I'm not their constituency. Their constituency is Wall Street. So I don't I'm not in that typical group where I'm asking people to do things. I am more interested in trying to build an alternative. And yes, I think that, there are definitely moments where we should fight back. But there's this reactionary issue that I feel that a lot of activist spaces and a lot of activist, initiatives have, which is we're always on our heels and we're reacting to something that happened, as opposed to not just fighting for something but building it. And this is a thing. Like we should be anti-capitalist and anti-racist and anti-fascist, but what are we for? What are we building for? And I think this is something that is coming up a lot right now, particularly as the pandemic has made the reality of life under capitalism that much more stark and disgusting to see. If we're not talking about overthrowing the government, which I also think is a rather silly notion and very romanticized, but how do we sidestep? How do we make that government obsolete? That government that doesn't work for us? And to your point, Shane, I think there's a lot of things locally that people can do. I mean, right now in D.C., there is a ballot initiative to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms. I think that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Go vote to decriminalize that. But I also think that we have to understand that the larger machine is something that cannot be voted out. Power concedes nothing. And so this really highlights the need for organizing in our local spaces and creating these networks that are larger, creating networks that span not just this country, but around the world. And the pandemic has also made that possible because we're all dealing with the same problem at the same time under the same global capitalist structure. So the amount of networking, the amount of tactical sharing and things like that's been happening is really, really powerful and really inspiring. And I think that now is a really great time to highlight the manifold possibilities and the manifold tactics that people are using, and not highlight the power of voting in our particular system. So I think that the change that we want, the change that we feel is possible, is not going to come in the ballot box, but it's going to come through grassroots activism and grassroots organizing that is then networked and spread, throughout the nation and throughout the world.
Eleanor, we've got like 1 minute left here, and I kind of wanted to do a couple of things. I'm going to do the second one, but first I just want to highlight Initiative 81 is the initiative you're talking about to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms and other entheogenic plants too. Not that mushrooms are plants. That's a big taxonomic difference there. Anyway, that's thing one. Thing two is, can you please tell us, I've heard you've won some awards recently, multiple film festival awards. So congratulations on that. Official selection award at the Cannes Film Festival. What's been going on there, Eleanor?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, the film has been doing pretty well, and I'm very I'm honored to share these stories with folks because, as I noted earlier at the beginning of this segment, West Virginia is really a microcosm of the entire nation, and as you also pointed out, Shane, a larger world that is being that's been destroyed and harmed by corporate malfeasance and by dirty energy. So I think that it's something that resonates with people. It's something that resonates with people in a lot of different ways, both in terms of like the class struggle and the environmental struggle. And the film has been doing well. It's gotten 8 official selections, and we're doing screenings. And folks who are doing educational work and organizing work are welcome to reach out to me via hardroadofhope.com to learn more.
Eleanor, that's great to hear. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
For those listening, that was Eleanor Goldfield. She's an award-winning documentarian, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, we were just talking about that. Over 8 official selections there. Covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. You can check out that documentary at hardroadofhope.com. We'll be back in a minute. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we're slightly confused. I don't know what happened there. That was not a normal dropout. That was a weird, sudden, spontaneous dropout,
Well,
apparently, in any event.
I thought we lost you because it was like bloop, and I was like, all right, what just happened? I was like, what just happened?
I thought I lost you too. We've had weird problems in the studio recently with audio stuff playing, and so I was like, wait, did something get dropped there? And then I'm not going to get into the details. It's a random drop, though. 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you'd like to give us a call. Again, that's 202-521-1320. I see what happened. Andre is now explaining to me what happened there. I'm gonna say that's not my fault. I'm gonna not take the L on that one. In any event, 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you want to call us. Interesting conversations, Jamarl. I'll be honest, man. I'm kind of feeling some ennui here, having problems in this relationship, and I'm realizing that, like, on my end, a personal relationship, I'm realizing that, like, there's a lot of stuff I need to work on. There's a lot of stuff I need to work out. And as these things often go, like, there's a fault on each side, or there are multiple faults on each side. And so I'm trying to, like, focus on, okay, what can I do on my end moving forward to repair myself and improve myself as a human being in order to have some more solid basis of stability emotionally and conceptually and all these different things. But it's difficult, man. It's difficult.
Let me say it this way. As human beings, we interact with various people. And it's not always easy to determine things that you find as flaws in yourself, or whether you don't find that as a flaw in yourself, but you're taking it from somebody else. Meaning, there's something to be wrong with you, or something to be right with you, and it could be your interaction with the person that makes it worse, if it makes sense. There are things or let me say it this way. I'm saying this in a weird way. But basically, the aspect of you may not be at fault, or may not be flawed. Somebody may think it is. And there's a difference between that person's perception of you versus who you actually are. So you could be in a relationship with somebody, and there could be things that that person makes worse. There could be things that person makes better. There could be things that person doesn't like about you that are perfectly fine. And there are things that they may dislike about you that may not be fine. Like, those things are difficult to find out. Reality doesn't give us any way out on this stuff. It's oftentimes you're washed in perceptions. And it is very difficult to determine whether their perception of you is accurate or whether their perception of you is just their perception of you. If that makes sense.
Especially if they know you pretty well, like if you've revealed yourself to them and they like have these insights into your psychology and they can give you those perspectives, and some of those are totally on point. And then there's this sort of edge, this indiscernible edge of where does this stop? Where these impressions they have of me. That's right. Okay, I know that's right, but is that right? And you kind of can't tell. And at a certain point, it's like you start questioning yourself. Anyway, that's definitely a dynamic I'm going through right now.
I mean, but that's just more. The thing is determining whether the perception is right or wrong. And over time, I've gotten to the point of, it's like a person's image of me, I don't all that much care about. What I care about is whether or not it's accurate or whether or not it's not.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's always hazy because, we all have blind spots in regards to the way that we interact and we behave. I mean, myself. There were certain things in dealing with teams that I had to, was like, okay, wait a minute. Is this me? Or is this the team? Or is this just, is there underlying stressors where I respond to it in a particular way? Like all that stuff. I mean, that's part and parcel to being a person, and being introspective as being a person. That's not a bad thing. The problem becomes in when the outside perception is taken too genuinely, if that makes sense. Because there are aspects of you that are just you.
Where you feel it too strongly, or you take it too immediately.
Or if you take the heart, or if you even believe it immediately. I mean, I don't think people can give you all sorts of things that they think is wrong with you, and oftentimes those things line up with some aspect of them. Meaning it's not typically you as an absolute. It could be, but that's why I say it's difficult, because it's trying to figure out, are these things that I don't like about myself? Meaning, are these things that, I could probably change, or that do need to change in my relations? And keep in mind, that's a total self-conception. Like, whether you think that's right, wrong, needs to change, or not needs to change is entirely part and parcel to who you are and who you want to be. It's not easy being a person.
It's not. You know what? We've got calls. Thank you for those kind words and those wise words, Jamarl. We've got 3 callers on the line. I want to make sure we get to them all. Sean from Maryland, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, what's up, guys? How you doing this morning?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. So I just wanted to say, like, when your guest was on, my challenge to your guest is she's looking. We all look through different lenses. So when I look at voting, and I say to her, voting does matter, because voting really is a push for fundamental fairness, right? So like when the founding fathers wrote those documents, they weren't talking about black men and women and stuff like that. We know that, right? But they didn't explicitly exclude them when they wrote the document, which leaves it wide open for interpretation, right? So if we just strive for fundamental fairness, that's how you push agendas and push things forward. Because it becomes kind of awkward if people are resisting you, but you're fighting for fairness. So like the George Floyd situation, if you really break it down, it was really a call to those who was kind of discounting what poor black folk been saying for a long time, or disenfranchised people. So now we got to sit home and see it unfold. So those same people, a lot of them weren't with Colin Kaepernick, right? When he made the protest, it was about a flag. But now they flipped, and then now they see it through a different lens, and now we have Black Lives Matter. So it's all about perception. But if we know that documents, laws, and all these kind of things, some of them are not right. But the way that you do is you got to sift through the law and shoot for the fundamental fairness, and that's the platitudes of the document that we live by supposedly in this country. So things can come and change, but people just have to get together. So leaving this last point, I think that if Black Lives Matter people and people who were fundamentally Trump supporters were in the same room, they will all figure it out that it's about the money, dude. Just get to the money. And why are we fighting over BS when we should just need money? That's it.
Interestingly enough, I completely agree with you on that last point. I think that there's this parallel universe where back in 2012, 2013, in some other world, the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement came together and sort of merged into one mass representation political movement. And, you can have problems with one, you can have problems with the other, largely depending on what side of the political spectrum you're currently on. If that had happened, I think we would be living in a dramatically different world right now. In some sense, there would be a real opposition to the duopoly that we're currently living in with the Democrats and the Republicans. We've got two other calls, Jamarl, but real quick, what do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, I think, I don't know if it's that easy to put those two in a room, but I do think our issues, our problems are very minor in comparison to our likes. I mean, to our likeness. And yeah, it doesn't need to be a mass movement. I mean, I would love for these groups to kind of put down almost or let's say to see like a Venn diagram in regards to what they push for and what they act, because that's the only way you can really get a determination whether these guys can get into the same room. But yeah, I broadly agree. We have D from California. D, what's up? What's going on?
Yeah, I think the two sides of the political spectrum you're talking about overlap a lot on the foreign policy and trade. But the other aspect that you alluded to is a lot of the cultural sort of touchstone issues that folks are just so quick to, they touch a nerve, I remember speaking with someone on the conservative side about being a single issue, or abortion being a single issue in the contest. And it was just, just goes right to, but what an important issue. And it's hard to get asked for so many people. So, I don't know where a resolution comes.
Thank you, Dee. And we have one more caller. Shane, you want to say anything about that one?
Honestly, Dee, are you still there?
Oh, I am.
He might have dropped. Oh, yeah. Okay, so can you just give me, I think you said abortion. Can you give me another couple examples of what kinds of issues you think are really dividing people?
I saw so much opportunity in this cycle, and so made an extra effort to reach out to different people, wherever I was, and maybe some older. I'll tell you of an older person I met who just would immediately go to the physical appearance of windmills as a sort of point against changing our energy dependencies. And I mean, look at these scaffolds, electrical grid things, and the power lines. It's just there's always something. And it comes from the media, the point they'll go to immediately. But I know you have another caller too. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the call, D. I still kind of maybe come back in on some other day and we can pick this conversation back up. I still don't feel like I quite understood where you're coming from there.
Well,
but
I think he's trying to say that there are cultural issues like abortion, guns, religious liberty, at work, those type of things, immigration issues. Like, there are issues that are cultural that go beyond just the nuts and bolts economics. And his point is that the Republican Party often, like I said, the lesser the vote, the better they tend to do because they have interests that go beyond just the economic stuff. I think that's his point more than anything else. And that's why I kind of say, I don't know if these guys can get together in the way that we think they can get together, even if they agree with one or two issues. The cultural stuff may be, I guess, overwhelming.
Where it comes down for me, I mean, real quick is, the Democrats have cultural issues too. Each party has doubled down on cultural issues more and more over the years as time has gone. And as far as I can tell, with the Democrats, this looks like the SJWs or whatever. That's the term that the rightists will use. The social justice warrior thing. Yeah. But in any event, Brave, calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, what's going on, guys? Good morning. I don't think there's enough time for me to cover my points in full, so I'll try to get straight to it. Eleanor's point. I totally agree with her. And I've come more and more to the conclusion that the vote, and I'm not speaking specifically against local elections. I can agree that local elections have the highest impact as far as voting goes. But I can't help, especially with things that have happened over these past few years. And it's not so much Trump, but what's come to light because of Trump's behavior and opposition to him, and the overall weakness that is shown not only in our system, but just in our public at large. You know, the ability to think critically is dissipating. We talk about tolerance, but then we can't tolerate, you know, anything outside of our bubbles. And this is this position that we've been pushed into. And it brings me back to this grand illusion that I feel like we've all been sold. You know, I don't want to take up too much time.
That way, you know what? I'm going to cut you off there because that's an interesting thing to call back on. If you want to call back in tomorrow, we should have an open segment for you. I'd love to get to you early on that one. In any event, thank you for the call, Brad. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening, folks.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You're going to see my mug, I think, for one or two videos. I have a doctor's appointment today, so you're not going to see me for too many videos for today. But great show. Let's see. I'm trying to make sure we don't have any guests. The Eleanor thing, I think I partially agree with her. I understand where she's coming from. I think the issue is, if you have an electoral system where the country tries feverishly, meaning the people in office, to stop your population from voting, and you get like half of the population that votes with the other half not thinking it matters. And a large part of the half that doesn't think it matters are people who've been disaffected or alienated in the society, meaning those people don't have the luxury of voting for any random hack. Those people actually need things to change. And they've gotten dejected from the political process, realizing that the person who they vote for, even if it's a Democrat, doesn't necessarily result in real change. And so those people get disaffected by the whole thing. I mean, even Obamacare left 26 million people out of healthcare at the moment it was signed, despite the fact they were pushing it like it was universal healthcare. It was not. It was not. So I can't necessarily say she's wrong for coming to the conclusion that it seems like voting in part of the process, that people take as the only part of the process, is not, in fact, the most important. It's kind of the end result of a lot of other work that went into play, either by people who are pushing for change, either by movements, by protests, by pretty much leverage in the political system. I think I agree with it partially, but I partially disagree with it also. Voting is a weapon, just like anything else. And it's an inflection point that allows leverage into your political system for people who have otherwise been dejected from the political system. Meaning your ability to make a candidate win or lose is a power. Even though they try to tell you all the time that you have nowhere else to go, you do have somewhere else to go. You cannot vote Democrat. Meaning your vote should not be given away for free. It's not a perfunctory thing. It's actually pretty damn important, especially in the context of putting somebody in office or taking that person out of office. The left, African Americans, many Hispanics, have been told for the longest time, in the last 40, 50 years, you have nowhere else to go. And they've appropriated this and believe in saying you're right. I'm saying in order to get any real political change to take place, it can't be a locked vote. A locked vote rationally incentivizes the continued taking advantage of that individual or that group. And that is basically what you've seen in our political system. And so until blacks, Hispanics, lefties, etc., get to the point where they realize that the job of the candidate is to get their vote, and the job of the person themselves is to hold the political system accountable. Until that understanding takes place, nothing changes. Because you will always be cowed and locked into this mindset of, I have nowhere else to go. I got to vote for this random Democrat. Throwing yourself at the Democrat. as opposed to having that person represent your interests, and you hold that person to account to represent that interest and forcefully fight for the policies that you're pushing for. If you're in the midst of a pandemic and you have 30 million people out of a job, meaning there's a healthcare emergency, you have 30 million out of a job because our healthcare is attached to our jobs. Now you have like 30, 40 million people without healthcare. That's irrational society. The people of that society rationally, especially the people who believe in that stuff, call for Medicare for all. And despite getting 88% of people in the Democratic Party who back the policy, you still can't get the leaders of the party to back the policy. Now, what is a party if the leaders don't care what the people of that party wants? The constituency of the Democratic Party is not the left, nor is it the randomness of the population. It is basically the wealthy that contribute to it. Biden is going to get 1.6 billion, if not more. This is going to be the most expensive election ever. Do you think they're giving him that money for shits and giggles and for free? And if they're not giving it to him for free, meaning there are entanglements around that vote, then how are you ever going to get what you want? If you're on the left and you can't get Medicare for all through with 88% support, if you're on the left and they're trotting Republicans out on stage, if you're on the left and these guys are out there attacking lefties, meaning people who the Democrats brought on stage, Republicans, turns around and attack lefties. How can you ever get what you want if you don't even have the respect to command any sort of leverage in the party? Meaning your level of capability of demanding respect is so low that they will bring on Republicans to attack elements that's supposed to be within the context of his own party. Sherry Bustos, the DCCC, the DSCC, attacking lefties. What did Elizabeth Warren say? You were uniquely violent or something. I'm making a point to you that the party has attacked you remorselessly for the entire time, and they've gotten across in very clear terms that they don't agree with your policies. And despite all of that, the overwhelming majority of lefties are still going to vote Democrat. What does that say? What does that incentivize? What it incentivizes is for you to be taken advantage of. And it is a rational act for the Democrats to do so. Ruins, what is it? Oh, Rui Sapphire. Thank you, Rui Sapphire. And there's a rainbow here, and I appreciate the rainbow. All right, guys, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys later.